Okay, now it is time for the Urbana City Council meeting. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
Here.
Mr. Bowersox?
Here.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Present.
Mr. Lewis?
Present.
Mr. Roberts?
Here.
Mr. Smythe?
Here.
Ms. Stevenson? Mayor Pressing.
Here. The first item, approval of minutes of the previous meeting. We have October 15th special meeting and October 15th the regular meeting.
So moved.
Motion by Charlie Smythe. Is there a second?
I'll second.
By Dennis Roberts. Ms. Stevenson, did you want to say something?
It said that I was absent from the special meeting, and I wasn't absent. I just wasn't here when we called roll call to go up into closed session, but I was at closed session.
Okay. Can we correct that, Madam Clerk? Okay. All right. Any other additions or corrections? If not, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries. Additions to the agenda. No additions? Here we are, petitions and communications. Time for the public to talk. Okay, many of you have said you wish to speak on other items besides demolition delay. Randy Kangas.
Hi, I'm Randy Kangas, 804 West Main Street in Urbana. First, I'd like to thank you for your the amount of time and effort you put in. It's extraordinary to me how much time and effort you do put in. I couldn't do it. I would like to talk a little bit about the historic district. I'm sure you've probably heard as much as you want to hear on it, but I would like to say a few little additions anyway. I see this as a fairly mild set of ordinance. It talks about major renovations. And I'd at least want to give one example, and forgive me if I get this wrong, but as one example, if I went to Farm and Fleet and bought a 6x6 storage shed, I couldn't put that on my front lawn. I couldn't put that above the front corner of my house. The neighbors could complain. I would have to have it demolished. But I could put on a 30-foot addition onto my house without any review, which would completely alter the neighbors all the way down the street. So this is a very old part of Urbana. The lot sizes are irregular. They vary dramatically, and it creates some challenges and opportunities. Secondly, I've heard some people say that this is just what a couple people think are historic. There's a whole process here. There is an ordinance. There has been an application. There has been residential support. Historic research has been done. Went through the Historic Preservation Commission. They examined it. They supported it 7-0. They looked at cutting down the district size. They voted against that unanimously. The staff has been supportive. Other organizations such as PACA have been supported. So it's not like just a couple of people came up with this would be a good idea. We have followed the process that the city put forth. I'd also like to mention that I like it's local, that if there are problems with this ordinance, we can deal with it locally. If it's not working, if it's horribly burdensome, it can come back to the city council again, and there can be modifications. Lastly, to the district itself, most of the buildings on this block were at one point or another rented out. The house I'm in was actually rented out to students, and I've been at least told by the prior owner that it was slated for demolition. Nearly all of them were lost at one point. They were saved by a number of dedicated, far-sighted people. A few of them are here. Some of them are gone now. And I'd like to thank them for giving this district a second life. Lots of the other buildings built by the founders of Urbana are now gone. But it is endangered and a fragile area. There are pressures on it. This is a very small facade. We're talking about one city block, both sides of the street. And it's representative, really, of Urbana's development. It starts in the 1860s and moves forward to about the 1930s. Each of the houses are of value to the others. I don't think they can't stand alone. They need to put together as a district. So with that, I think the real question is, do we want to retain any of the development from Urbana's first century? I'd urge you to support the petition and take the district as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Carolyn Baxley.
Carolyn Baxley, 510 West Main Street. Randy was very eloquent. I can hardly add anything to what he said, other than I would like to remind the council that Main Street has been under pressure ever since I've lived there, which is since 1981. And when we moved in 1981, it was zoned R5, multifamily. And over several years, it first got downzoned to R4, and then during the downtown to campus study, we got it downzoned to R2. At that time, there was unanimous support on both Plan Commission and Council for that downzoning, and we all, breathed a sigh of relief because it was an indication that there would be some measure of protection for the street. But now, the 800 block, and hopefully, in the not too distant future, some additional blocks as well, are coming before you to ask for the overlay district, the historic district that will put the seal on this area as one of the most historic in town. It's on a very significant road through the Fort Clark Road through Urbana. And as Randy has said, many of these houses were threatened with demolition before people came and restored them and moved back into them. Just since Norman and I have lived on the street, many families with young children have moved in. The area has been reclaimed with a few minor exceptions, and those are the opponents of this district. We do appreciate the fact that absentee landlords have investments in their properties, but I would also like to say that those landlords have had opportunities to sell those properties and have turned those down. So I would urge you tonight to approve the district as presented to you by your Historic Preservation Commission. That's what your commission is for. You have experts on it to advise you of which, cases that come before you deserve to be approved and which do not. They voted 7-0 for this district. It is one of the most significant streets in town, and I hope that you will consider that very carefully tonight as you vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mary Stewart.
I'm Mary Stewart. I live at 404 East Washington in Urbana. You actually already know my position on this issue. I'm a member of the Historic Preservation Commission, and as you know, we voted 7-0 in favor of designating this entire block as a historic landmark, historic district. And I wanted to address, tonight I wanted to come and speak as a resident of Urbana, not as a member of the commission, and address some of the issues that I think are relevant to your consideration of this question. I think one issue that's been lost in the debate about the 800 block of West Main Street is the concept of non-contributing properties and the role that non-contributing properties play in a historic district. So I'm going to read to you from the ordinance, which you, of course, are familiar with, but I think it bears repeating. According to our Urbana zoning ordinance, a non-contributing property is a building, structure, site, or object which may be part of a landmark or district, but does not possess historic significance per se. However, the relationship of these buildings, structures, sites, or objects to those that are contributing may be important to the preservation of the landmark or district. Inclusion of these properties within a historic district subjects these properties to those design review standards and guidelines applicable to non-contributing properties. I think, and it is, I would note also that it's standard practice with historic districts to go one lot deeper than the contributing properties in designating a district. So that's absolutely standard practice, and that is, I think, warranted, particularly in the case of the 800 block of West Main Street. All of the structures on this block have a historical relationship to the site, and particularly the structures at the end lots serve as a visual marker, a symbol of this site. The cohesiveness of the site is defined in part by the historical place, its relationship to the city of Urbana. Obviously, the presence of two Busey homes, the fact that Lincoln traveled the thoroughfare, the Fort Clark Road, compel us, I think, to preserve this block as one of the few remaining traces of our rapidly vanishing cultural heritage. Obviously, there's a mixture of architectural styles on this block. I think that's actually part of its character, that we have structures that represent a large chunk of the architectural continuum, culminating in the 1951 ranch style at 816 West Main. It's the history of the entire block that is the unifying feature for this historic district. The trail that linked Danville with Bloomington and Peoria didn't skip these non-contributing properties. When Lincoln traversed this historic road, he went straight down the trail. He didn't skip certain sections of the trail. I think it's important then to observe the natural boundaries of the block. The area contiguous to the contributing properties has a profound impact on preserving the historical significance. Without the tool of design review for the non-contributing properties, we could end up with incompatible structures in a very short time. The historical character of the block could be violated by having end lots or other excluded properties with incompatible design. I know this has been cast as a question of property rights in many of the discussions that have taken place. And I'd just like to point out that actually none of us have unconditional property rights. I can't set fire to my house. I have to observe zoning laws with respect to the use of my property. And, you know, our city, in fact, our nation is built on the concept of the social contract. And I think preserving our cultural heritage is and should be part of the social contract. The question for you to consider is not whether we should have a historic preservation ordinance. We have one. The question is whether we're going to apply it. Thank you.
Thanks. Diana Visick.
I'm here to, at the moment, to address the Neighborhood Conservation District issue. In reading this latest draft, Diana Visick, 608 West Pennsylvania Avenue. In reading this latest draft of the NCD ordinance, I was struck by the contradictions in this process. When the Plan Commission considered this topic, they voted unanimously to recommend we try other approaches to solving neighborhood problems. Both the Plan Commission and concerned citizens suggested listing the specific problems we would like to solve and then seeing if existing ordinances can be used to address them. This process has not been done, either because the city doesn't want to put in the work or because imposing new regulations is more fun. But citizens don't want more regulations complicating their lives. A stated purpose of this ordinance is to respond to neighborhood concerns, in other words, the will of the people. Yet this draft doesn't address the concern expressed by most members of the public who spoke the last time the council considered NCDs, namely the small number of people who could impose this regulation on their neighbors. This draft still says that only 15% of residents in the proposed district are needed to sign a petition in order to initiate the process. A neighborhood association can also initiate the process, presumably by voting at a meeting. The problem with allowing neighborhood organizations to decide is that there might be very few residents at a meeting, even less than the 15% required for a petition. The major public objection is to the requirement that only 60% of property owners who respond to the city's letter would need to vote yes in order to institute an NCD. We're not talking about 60% of residents in the proposed district, but 60% of those who return the ballots sent to them by the city. If people are out of town or otherwise miss the mail, a minority of residents could impose an NCD on everyone else. 25% of owners in the district are required to file an official protest against being designated an NCD. The city's bias in favor of NCDs shows up in the differing standards applied to multiple owners of one property who approve the NCD versus those who protest it. Only 50% of the owners of a property are needed to register a yes vote for the NCD. For example, if 2 out of 4 owners want the NCD, that counts as a yes. But to protest against being designated an NCD requires a majority, which would mean 3 out of the 4 owners. That's not fair. The worst part about filing an official protest is that the City Council could choose to ignore it entirely. The deck is clearly stacked. Perhaps the most citizen-unfriendly part of this ordinance is that once an NCD is in place, the Council can amend it in any way, at any time, with no further input from residents. This ordinance makes clear that citizen involvement is a sham. A tiny minority of neighborhood residents can start a process that gives aesthetic control to the City Council with no later recourse. One council member stated that he had no problem with the city exercising such control because, quote, "we'll do the right thing." That's the line used by governments throughout history to justify their actions. In fact, that's the line being used right now by the Bush administration to violate the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says, quote, "nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation," unquote. Some people say that since NCDs are a form of zoning, they don't violate our property rights. But this line of reasoning can be used to justify regulating anything, down to the color of petunias we're allowed to plant. Real estate is a bundle of rights, and many of them are being taken away by the NCD ordinance. The Council wants to use their definition of aesthetics to limit what property owners are able to do. The last contradiction concerns property values. In theory, this ordinance is designed to keep property values high by eliminating ugliness. Yet it drives off owners by imposing burdensome regulations which could change at any moment. At least with restrictive covenants, prospective buyers know what they're agreeing to before they buy. Moreover, amendments to the covenants have to be voted on by the residents, not a tiny council, most of whose members don't live in the neighborhood. Aesthetics is highly subjective, and I find it amazing the council feels their sense of aesthetics is superior to those who actually own and care for a property. This attitude is elitist and arrogant and will probably offend many other citizens.
Thank you. Sherry Earl. You're not speaking? Okay. But you are in favor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Of all the
Okay. Jasper Von Hale Wick? Wake?
Also not speaking, but in favor.
Okay. Carl Long.
Carl Long, owner, 812 West Main Street. So how's everyone doing tonight? Here we are again, all right. So duplex, 812 West Main Street. My tenants had a Halloween party. 300 people showed up in the house. That's historic. No, seriously, I'm sorry, guys. It's just been so serious around here. I'm just going to throw a couple facts out. You know, at this point, I'm 3 years into property management and ownership. Maybe I'm wrong about what I believe. Maybe I'm right. Maybe I've got a lot left to learn. So let me just throw out how I feel, and you know, you guys will ultimately decide. The people behind me, the people that live in my neighborhood at 812 or at 800 West Main, great people. I mean, I have met most of them so far, and I think they're all very nice. I think there are some amazing properties there. But what concerns me is if this gets passed, is what my house being labeled historic is gonna have to show as me as an owner. I mean, I own a duplex. It's got aluminum siding on it. It's got 2 doors. I don't see the history there any longer. I just see it as a rental, and shame on me if that's not right. And then I see an apartment complex catty corner from it, and I see a brand new home across the street from it. I see an empty lot at another angle from it. And it just concerns me that what we're doing is, even though we have some houses that probably are historic on that block, I'm worried that we're giving the wrong idea to other people as they come down that area that, hey, you know, anything's historic that's on this block now because we've decided it, because some of us have decided it. And then I think that's wrong. I think that if Main Street as a whole, as this traveling area, as you guys have described it from Danville throughout Urbana through to Champaign, is an important path, an important road that many people had experiences and history on, then let's push to make Main Street on a long distance a historic street. But why do the properties have to be considered historic if they don't possibly have that value? I'm just worried that we're shortchanging what we really want a historic property to be here. And like I said, you know, maybe I'm incorrect in my assumption on that, but I am just worried that I'm going to be asked to maintain a house as a historic property that no longer really has that value that maybe it did 50 years ago, when unfortunately it looks like no one really seemed to care about that house. When it was picked up by the previous owner, I don't know what shape it was in, but I think I've probably put in more care with the tenants that are there now to try to at least rebuild it and give it some value than anyone has in the past 20 or 30 years. Like I said, I'm concerned about that. And then what concerns me also is we keep talking about these demolition time periods of 50 and 75 years, and then we talk about how new construction bad, old construction great, but what happens 50 years from now then? Are we going to sit here and say that Wakeland's new building, 2 years old across from me, is historic and that it should not be taken down for something that might have a greater design or a greater purpose? I'm just worried that we're pigeonholing and that we're maybe thinking ahead of ourselves as to what we really consider historic and what we don't. I just really hope that we can come to a conclusion here of nominating the proper properties as historic, and I'll stand out there and I will say to my kids and to my friends, hey, look at that Italianate, look at that arts and crafts house. Those have some history, those still have amazing architecture, and there's my duplex right there. I'm proud of that too, but those houses are historic, not the entire block. Like I said, Main Street as a whole, yeah, I'm sure it's got some amazing history, and let's push on that street or other streets, but let's not pigeonhole homes and say that there are things that they're not. And, you know, once again, I trust in your guys' decision tonight, and I just hope that I can continue to at least have the same relationship and support of my fellow owners on 800 that I've had so far, because they've been, you know, whether we're at odds at this, they've still been great neighbors and great friends to me so far. So, thank you all. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Mr. Smythe.
One way to deal with this might be to, well, let me ask you this. How would you maintain the character of a neighborhood if it's historic?
What defines character then? Is it the age and the architecture of the house, or is it the people that live on the neighborhood?
I think it's the combination of the houses, the street, the trees, it's the ambience of the entire area. So, you know, how would you maintain, you know, people have invested and restored their homes, and how would you maintain general character that would encourage people to continue with maintaining those homes and so on.
Sure, and that's really where this is all coming from, isn't it? It's the and I hope I'm not in that category yet, that I'll never be in, the supposed absentee landlords that, and I've seen, I mean, I'm from Arizona originally, a 50-year-old house is historic there, that's an old house. Here we have 100-year-old houses that I see around, I see houses that are decrepit and falling apart, and it's sad to see that. That is definitely a sad sight. I thought that we had proper zoning and town regulations in terms of you have to get a permit to cut those trees down. Someone, I thought maybe would give you a ticket or some kind of citation if you don't properly maintain your property. To a historic level, maybe that's different. But I am under the impression if I allow my property to look poorly, that's why we now have these inspections.
Well, that's the ordinance we passed last year, yeah.
Okay, and that's great, but does that make it historic? No. That means as a landlord, I need to maintain the property and make sure it's in good working order.
Okay, so you think that maintaining your property would, and keep it in good working order would contribute to maintaining the character of the neighborhood?
Yes,
right.
yes, I do.
Okay, so one aspect, as Mary Stewart spoke earlier, there are those houses that contributed and there are non-contributing houses. Your house would probably, might be considered non-contributing. You obviously consider it that way.
I do.
One of the alternatives is design review. Okay, so if you have a neighborhood that has contributing and non-contributing houses, and the non-contributing houses are only subject to design review on demolition, is that an acceptable compromise?
That's a good question. I mean, did what Wakeland, when he built that new property across the street from me, he obviously had that reviewed, and I personally, I don't think it's a bad-looking property. Is that wrong? But is it the fact that other neighbors might not want that next to them? I mean, is that where we're falling into the trap of what we don't want as our next-door house to look like? Or maybe.
Well, I think we've got a couple of examples on Green Street of design review at the corner of Kohler and Green. Where a couple of properties were rebuilt. They're fairly substantial, and there was design review in a successful way. Those basically, with some, there's, your mileage may vary depending on what you think of certain aspects of it, but those two structures fit in with the neighborhood.
You're right, and I'm honestly, I'm not even here with any intent to demolish anytime soon. I'm negative equity in this right now. I'm still building up. I want my house.
But I think that's the point Mary Stewart was providing, was that there are contributing and non-contributing houses to this neighborhood, and the non-contributing, by being subject to design review, which would be essentially the only thing left in creating a historic district, is that an acceptable compromise for maintaining the character of a block neighborhood?
I think it's hard for me to be the one to say that. I think design review, actually, yes, I do. I think design review is an acceptable compromise, because as long as we can come to a fair, unbiased, based on maybe certain historic attributes that you might expect, if we can come to a fair conclusion that all parties agree on, that's fine. And you know what? I would be happy to throw in certain front porches, things like that.
Yeah, that's what design. That's design review.
Sure,
yeah,
and I think we probably, and I have yet to work with one. I know we have amazing architects in this town, and I'd be happy to work with one of them on something like that down the road at Main Street. When the time comes that I'm worried that I can't maintain and keep that house standing strong and I have to build new, I would be happy to sit down with your review team and come up with another beautiful structure.
You've answered my question. Thank you very much.
Charlie. Anyone else?
Mr. Bowersox.
Yeah, Mr. Long, just a quick question. We'll get to this later in the evening, but Danielle Chenoweth has distributed a motion that's on our desks here tonight for one possible way to proceed. I know when this item was originally considered, your house was included on the contributing list.
Yes.
That meant you would be subject to the full-blown historic preservation landmark rules. In Danielle's motion, and I'm sure we'll discuss this a lot more later, but your house is listed on the non-contributing list.
Okay.
So that it wouldn't be subject, because it would be considered non-contributing, to the same level of review. Instead, the only review would basically be that if you demolished it and wanted to build something different, you'd have to do the kind of design review Charlie mentioned. So I guess I wonder, do you feel like that's more appropriate and sort of captures the level of significance that 812 has on that block?
Well, Brandon, let me ask you, so would that still make my house a historic house as part of a historic district then? Because I'm just concerned that my house has already been changed in ways that took away the there's stories that obviously happened at that house. People built that house, people live there. Does the current look of my house negate that? No, probably not. But I'm just concerned that when someone drives up to see that property and they see 2 front doors and aluminum siding, that they might feel like they got taken for a ride, that, you know, they came to see something that no longer exists. So I don't know. I mean, I'd be happy to be considered a non-contributing property, but honestly, if this passes, I will just have to work with you guys and do whatever it takes to maintain what you guys are assigning me as a historic district. So,
Okay,
you know.
I think just to answer your question, I think the answer is that Mary Stewart probably described it best, that yes, the property, if it were listed as non-contributing, would be part of the district and really considered
Sure.
part of the district, but because it wouldn't be contributing to the historicness of the district per se and on its own, it wouldn't be subject to the historic reviews other than for you building something new there.
But what does that, I mean, what does that involve when someone hears about the 800 block that's historic? They drive down the block, they see signs that say Spanish 8 contributing, yellow duplex not contributing. I just feel that we're ruining the experience for people at that point. But if they go because they know there's a historic house, Spanish 8, and I apologize, there's 5 or 6 other beautiful houses. I don't remember them all. Spanish 8 sticks in my head. But if they go there knowing there's 4 houses that they can go see on the 800 block of Main Street that are historic and amazing because those owners have chosen to nominate and maintain them at that level, I think that's a completely different thing that we're proposing at that point. And I think we all win at that level.
But I think that's the whole point, is that if your home is found non-contributing, you get to have your way, essentially, and the district as a whole can be maintained in character. And so as a whole. I think that's what we're trying to get to.
Sure.
And so for your direct property interests, you get 95% of what you want. Okay? The only place it kicks in is design review. That's
Sure.
the answer.
And I agree with you.
There's nothing else that really, comes into play. Your contribution is down the road, maybe, at the point of demolition.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. And I just hope that I'm not overstating the
Subject, of course, to the new property maintenance regulations and so on.
And I just hope I'm not overstating the same point. I just was concerned about saying, hey, all these houses are historic and not being able to live up to that actual standard with what's already happened to my house. And I didn't make those changes. They were made before I got there.
Mr. Roberts.
Thoughtful thoughts. Appreciate your comments. In the part of the consideration of it being a historic trail, i.e., it was a route that was originally an Indian trail and it's now become, a city street called Main Street. And during the process of the development of the city, of course, there have been many different kinds of buildings and structures built along the street. I'm sure at one time there were probably just cottages or outbuildings on a farm.
Sure.
Eventually, somebody purchased the property, and it got subdivided, and new things have been put in. So there's many, very, very many streets in our city that have a variety of kinds of quality of historic homes. Do you think that that's a problem, or do you think that it can only be a historic area if every single building on a block is of equal merit?
That's also a great question, Dennis. And unfortunately, when the property was brought to me to purchase, it wasn't, hey, I've got a 100-year-old house with historic merit. It was, hey, I've got a 6 times rent multiplier. You want to check it out? I mean, unfortunately, the historic merit of that property was never, I didn't know what I was getting into. I was still fresh in the game and young, and once again, from Arizona, not really understanding what real history of a town is. No, I don't think it's hard for me to say, yes, I think the look of my house is part of why I don't think it's historic, and then it's hard for me to say that, no, that should be the only factor. That's like, I feel that's very superficial. But I just am concerned that my now converted duplex, it's building its own new history now. I don't think that it still represents the history of the past.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good luck, guys.
Scott Dossett.
Good evening. I need to start with an apology. If I had known that I was going to be representing the elitists, I would have dressed up. But I didn't. Because I speak unabashedly tonight ask you to pass the Neighborhood Conservation District ordinance that's before you as probably your finest opportunity this year to do small d democracy. The cut points for percentages to get the thing rolling, and the cut points for the percentages to stop the thing, and the way the voting is to be done, I think, are most appropriate for a system which will include not only dozens of neighbors, but several city staff, and the combined throw weight of hundreds of hours of work that people are offering to do for the city of Urbana. When I spoke about NCDs in front of the Plan Commission, I opposed the ordinance as it was written and was happy that the ordinance was passed on with a recommendation to deny. A critical difference, I think, between what I saw in the ordinance or the opportunities and how it was written, there were a couple of them. One of them was the fact that the original ordinance was going to be a part of the historic preservation ordinance in Urbana. This is not a historic preservation question, it's a neighborhood preservation question. And so I hope that we're really clear on what we're trying to do here. That's where the small d democracy comes in. You're simply giving a 25-lot contiguous area the ability to organize itself and present itself to staff, and then to work through the types of design review and infill development after demolition that neighborhood sensitivities might lead itself to. I don't think that's onerous at all on current or future property owners. The rules for the design review stuff are already laid out, and the NCD as it's written now references those. They're pretty much lifted right out of the MOR, Mixed Office and Residential Design Review process that the Historic Preservation Commission and then I'm assuming City Council must have agreed. It isn't a matter of purely aesthetics, like I think you should have put more blue in your abstract. It's a matter of definable unit architectural concepts and measurable values that end up having the opportunity to get laced into this design review. We're talking about massing, we're talking about roof pitch, we're talking about things that your current staff now, without additional people on staff, have the ability to make decisions about. You've got good builders, people who have experience in the construction trades and who know this business. So I think what I hope you see the NCD ordinance as is allowing the neighborhoods to express themselves in a manner that will essentially preserve the neighborhood value. I will challenge all of you to drive down the 2 and 3 and 400 blocks of East Elm Street in Urbana and then decide whether or not you want Urbana to look like a barracks at Chanute. If best available practice for the people constructing rental property is continued to continue in a manner which only is meant to maximize their profit, then the character of your neighborhoods is gone. So again, I support the NCD ordinance as it's written, and I thank everyone for all of the time that they've taken, Libby, Robert, and all the staff, and certainly your time too, so thanks.
Thank you. Dan Folk.
I'm Dan Folk, 807 West Main, the petitioner for the Main Street Historic District. I expect probably most of you have heard everything you want to hear from me on this subject, and you know everything that I know. So I'm not sure there's a lot more I can say. I do want to thank everybody. I know all of you spent an awful lot of time on this, and I certainly don't think I would have done it. You are heroic for what you've done. I just leave you with the fact that, you know, what I think the 800 block wants and what I expect that the future historic districts that you're going to hear from soon want is protection not from all development. We're not trying to stop the future in its tracks, but we would like protection from the kind of development that's invidious to the historic character of those neighborhoods. And if you've got any questions for me, I'll be glad to answer. Splendid.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Chris Maffio? Okay, thank you. Glenn Stanko.
I intended to speak when it came up. Do you want me to speak now instead?
Well,
Or are you going to have input when you consider the ordinances?
you want to wait till we vote on the ordinance? That's okay? We can do that?
Take input before you vote, yes.
Sure. Okay. Naomi Jacobson, State Representative.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Naomi Jacobson, 803 West Main Street in Urbana. I want to thank you for putting this on reconsideration and for all the time that I know many of you have taken on this issue. So really, like many others have said, you've heard from us before, you know what our issues are. I certainly would ask that you vote in favor of this 800, that the 800 block be designated the historic district. It's really important to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood, as many of us have already said tonight, and to protect also the investments that many of us have made because of protecting the integrity of the history that comes along with that in our neighborhood. And protecting the investments that many of the people in the 800 block have made, restoring or preserving their homes. But in doing that, I think a lot of people have had in mind preserving the historic character and nature of the block that we live on, as well as the historic landmarks. It's been said, and I know you've read, that many important people in our history have lived in some of the houses and have traveled along this road. So I'm just here to ask, please vote yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen Coomer.
Hello once again, Karen Coomer, Executive Director of the Preservation Association. I'm here at this time to support the recommendations of your appointed Historic Preservation Commission in support of designating the 800 block of West Main Street as a historic district. I would like to stress that I believe that the district needs to include all the properties in the 800 block. Including 816, the little more modern ranch house, which I believe the owner, as I understand it, wants to have listed and be included in the district. The block is actually a continuum of architectural history. We have buildings from the 1860s in the Italianate style, through the prairie style, bungalows from the 1920s, vernacular buildings, ranch house from the 1950s, and including the 2006 house that was just recently built, and even an apartment building. But these all show the continuum of the architecture of the block, and as it grew as a block and as a neighborhood. And it has this integrity as a neighborhood. But we also seem to be stressing in many ways the architectural value of this block over its historic value. As many people have pointed out, that this was a historic trail, and the trail did not just stop, but included the land on either side of the trail. It didn't meander and just stop abruptly, but it was a cohesive entity in the history of the development of the city. And history is not only embodied in its physical buildings, but in the neighborhood, in the context of how this neighborhood grew and developed. Let's see. The protection of this character of the block is therefore very important, and I think that would be done best by including all of the buildings in the 800 block in the historic building, in the historic district. National Register criteria, which I think is usually recognized as the official criteria and is one that many historic preservation ordinances, such as yours is based upon, does not promote gerrymandering of boundaries for historic districts, but rather it looks for natural boundaries such as streets or alleys or mountains, streams, or rivers, something natural that makes a district more cohesive and concurrent. The setting of these and context of the buildings in this block is important, as are the individual architecture. That's what makes it a district, as opposed to individually nominated historic landmarks. It's the district in this case which is important, the entire block. And I'd really like to second Mary Stewart's comments. I think they were the most eloquent comments that I've heard yet tonight in any of the discussions about why it is important to make the entire block a historic district. Thank you.
Thank you. Bernadine Stake.
Well, I think that Karen Coomer, Mary Stewart, Carolyn Baxley, Van de Kangas have really made the case. And I hope that you will all vote for this historic district on Main Street. It's very important that we preserve in Urbana what we have now. We have lost a lot, but you're there now, and you're going to preserve a lot. So I appreciate that. Now, do you want me to talk about the other one, too? Or wait? But neighborhood conservation. Okay. Well, of course, I think that's very important because it comes from the bottom up, and the people in the neighborhood can decide what they want to do. And I'm not going to say much about that either because I know that you've worked on it a long time, and I hope that you're going to vote for it. But I will say that there are many places that I've read about that where it's working. Lake Forest, Illinois, Austin, Texas, Arlington, Virginia, Palos Verdes, California, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Arlington County, Virginia, Sanders, Tennessee, Casey, North Carolina, and Annapolis, Maryland. Those are just some of the places who have had great success with conservation districts. And so I hope that you will please vote for those. I'm very concerned about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Joan Zagorski.
I don't have anything else to add.
Okay. Danny Otto.
I won't repeat what everyone else has said in support of the ordinance. I would like to underline how important it is to maintain the unit as it's proposed. A minimum of a block seems to me to be as small as you can go, and if you start exempting things, you establish a bad precedent because every time someone comes, you're going to be tempted to exclude houses and let people remove their houses, and it becomes a hodgepodge and doesn't work. The thing that I'd like to address is the claim that this is somehow a taking and that the city is going to open themselves to liability in lawsuits. The city is always open to liability in lawsuits on any of the laws that you have on the books. They can be challenged. So
we've noticed that.
But the thing about the taking, I think, is exaggerated, and people misunderstand what the claim is. Our Constitution says that if something of value is taken from you for public good, you have the right to be repaid. The question is, what of value is being taken from you with this sort of an ordinance? Historically, the effect has been, over the long term, is to increase values. So there's no taking if the actual value of your property is increased by being included in this sort of improved neighborhood. And oftentimes, the sort of wild claims about taking are based upon a kind of calculation that I find very offensive. I mentioned that I took a house, it was a rooming house. I've talked to people who lived there when there were 4 kitchens and 18 residents in what is now a lovely single-family home. So the calculation that is made is that if I don't invest anything in maintenance, I take all the revenue I can get as long as I can. And at the point at which it becomes such a blight that everybody is relieved to have the thing torn down and improved, and then if I can get a variance to reduce the setback in order to increase the square footage and therefore the density of the new structure so I can maximize the income from the property, then I can take a property that might be assessed at $150,000 now and turn it not into a property that will pay $500,000 on the tax rolls, because these never do, but I can turn it into a property that the resale value based upon the multiplier of the income is $500,000. So that's not a taking if your calculation is that if I continue this trajectory of letting a property decline until everybody wants it torn down and then build something that really is out of character, squeezed into a lot, and generate, that's not a taking, and you're not going to have to defend yourself against that. And I can tell you that that happens because when I was in the market for a house, I looked at a lot of houses. I was one of these people looking to buy specifically in this neighborhood because of the character of the neighborhood. I came here because of what we have. And I looked at a lot of houses and rooming houses, and some of them were too much even for my optimistic spirit. And I talked to people who told me, well, I've got another house over here, but I'm really letting it go because I think that in a few years I might get the city to let me do X, Y, and Z. And so they didn't even want me to look at it. So this does go on in this town, and this ordinance and this district that's proposed is one way to slow that down and to tell people that you're going to need to maintain this. I think with respect to Mr. Long, he has nothing to fear from this. If he wants to have a rental property and have a nice place for the current residents to live, and he's going to keep a roof on it and keep it painted up, he can do that until the cows come home. This ordinance doesn't require him to restore the facade as long as he's not doing anything other than painting it and keeping a roof on it. So his investment is secure. There's no taking here. There is a taking if he wants to let it run down, take as much income out as possible, and then in 10 or 15 years come back and ask for a high-density unit there. So that's what I have to say. Be strong. Don't worry about the lawsuits. They'll come one way or another.
Thank you. Betsy Cronin.
I said all I had to say. Thank you.
Okay. Robert Dunn.
You want me to state my address again? 1910 South Ray Street. I originally was going to speak on the NCDs, which I'm against, but after hearing some of the comments, I just wanted to make an observation about like a general sense that I'm getting. There was an audience member who was on the Historic Preservation Commission that said something that is extremely offensive to me as an American. The idea that a government official can say that there are limits to rights that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence say are inalienable and do not come from government but from the laws of nature and nature's God is extremely offensive. My right to own property, to do whatever I want to it, should be mine, despite whatever government or elitist group thinks. My opinions are mine, no matter how offensive they might be to a group of people. And I find attitudes like that repulsive, un-American, and I'm just really concerned that you folks were elected and took an oath to uphold that Constitution. And if you're appointing people who have that attitude, I'm really concerned about that. So I'd like to know where you guys think our rights as Americans come from. Do they come from government? Do they come from bureaucracy? Do they come from an elite group, or are they inalienable? That they can never be taken away from by government because the times permit or because it's inconvenient for our little pet project. That's all.
Brian Adams.
Brian Adams, 412 West Elm Street, Urbana. I just wanted to briefly say that I do support the historic district nomination for the 800 block of West Main Street. I'm sorry. I support it in the form that it was originally passed on from the Historic Preservation Commission. I think it's important to maintain the cohesiveness of that block by not chopping it up into little pieces. So again, I just wanted to express my strong support for the 800 block of West Main Street Historic District. And also for the NCDs, I also support the idea of creating an ordinance to permit the creation of conservation districts. I think that, again, this is something that would just give neighborhoods the ability to do this if they wanted to. It would not be something that would be forced down their throats. So I think it would be a good thing. Again, I don't know how often it's going to happen, but at least there would be a framework that would exist for people that are concerned in a particular area. If they wanted to maintain their neighborhood in a particular way, this would give them the opportunity and the tools to do that. And just one final thing, I think it's important to realize that historic preservation and concern about our living environment is something that's important all over the country. There is a big movement in historic preservation that's been going on for years, and I think a lot of people that decide to move into areas that are being discussed tonight choose to move into those areas because they appreciate the cultural, the historical, the architectural environment, and people have a right to choose where they want to buy property. Nobody forces people to buy property. And maybe if certain people are concerned about these sorts of issues, they should think a little more carefully when they shop around to buy a house. I know we did. When we bought our house on Elm Street, we looked around in a lot of areas, and we liked the area. We knew that there were certain issues that came with it. We live in the mixed office residential area, but we valued other things about that neighborhood above the other ordinances that we are subjected to because we appreciate that area and we like that area. So I would just, for those people who are concerned, who seem to be spinning these horror stories about what's going to happen if some of these ordinances are put into effect, I think a lot of these stories are being blown out of proportion. A lot of these situations, these scenarios that are created are never going to happen. So that's all I'd like to say.
Thanks. Alice Novak.
I would also like to wait for the district comes up, please.
Okay. Ilona Batkovsky.
I would like to express my support for the ordinance, but I don't wish to speak.
Okay. Chris Storr.
Thank you. I'm Chris Storr, and I still live at 405 East High. One of the dangers in speaking so late, and it looks like it's going to be a long night for folks, is that everybody steals the thunder out of what you had to say. Scott Dossett did that, and I think very well, as the previous speaker. In referring to the neighborhood conservation districts, we had proposed this as sort of a bottom-up way of trying to deal with the particular problems of trying to soften the impact of infill development in a single-family or partially single-family neighborhood. We've seen a number of problems that have occurred, and as Scott rightly said, some of what has been proposed are not onerous details, as one person referred to, but really fairly basic elements such as massing and roof line and pitch and setbacks. These are things that are mostly observed and just to try to fit something in the neighborhood. I think I'll close with that.
Dennis Roberts.
Hey, Scott. And Chris, pardon me, I was thinking something else for a minute. Chris, it's been said that this is somewhat of an elitist situation, that people are telling people, other people, small percentage of the population is imposing its will or its interest on other people. Of course, we know that the ordinance only provides a mechanism for a plan to be brought forward, and it doesn't actually establish any particular plan at this point. I just wanted to ask you, as the head of HUNA, how many meetings do you think that were held, say, at the Methodist Church in basement, or in the Unity Church community room, that people were invited to attend to in the last 9 months? And how many times do you think staff came to give advice and encouragement to the neighborhood association as it tried to help the city form what this really some rather major changes in the ordinance as it had come to from the planning division?
Oh, thank you, Dennis. HUNA meets monthly. I'd ask one of the members here, do you know offhand how many hits or we get, or on our or people sit on our HUNA email list?
Hits?
Or how many people, how many subscribers do we have?
About 60.
We have about 60 people that subscribe to the HUNA email listserv, and I found it very interesting to occasionally run into one or the other of them that have never attended a meeting but follow the proceedings through the minutes that we post on the after the monthly meetings, and express their opinion as to how frequently the city council or city planning staff attended meetings. I can recall one meeting at the Wesleyan Church, and we've had a breakfast meeting with some of the staff. Those are the two that come to mind. Does that answer?
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. We'll move on to old business. First is ordinance number 2007-06-059, an ordinance approving a text amendment to the zoning ordinance of the City of Urbana, Illinois, adding section 13-5, neighborhood conservation districts, to the Urbana zoning ordinance. And Robert Myers is here from the staff. Our planner.
Very quickly, this ordinance would establish a process for property owners and neighborhood groups to initiate zoning overlay districts for protection of neighborhood character. And just as a reminder, this originated about a year ago after discussing it, a whole palette, if you want to call it that, of different possible solutions for neighborhood issues that our neighborhoods have been reporting. And this was seen as one tool that city staff should move forward with, and to, well, at least come forward with a proposal to everyone. And the committee of the whole specifically asked us to come forward with the neighborhood conservation district ordinance. I will say that it is neighborhood conservation district ordinance is in the City Council's work plan, in the comprehensive plan, and also it's been mentioned in plans and documents by both West Urbana neighborhood and Historic East Urbana neighborhood as being important to those organizations. What I've done is, based on input at the last meeting, I provided an updated proposed ordinance with underlines and strikeouts. And just to go over real quickly what's been changed, we've added timelines for the Historic Preservation Commission's courtesy review of neighborhood conservation district applications to make sure that doesn't can't necessarily go on forever, as was pointed out. Clarify where in the process the neighborhood plan is prepared. Provided design review limits. That was a specific request, not just talked about what design review should do, but what would not be allowed in terms of design review. Specify that variances and appeals are to be part of the process, and also specify public notice procedures for any district dissolved by the council. In terms of, just real quickly, I thought maybe I would address a couple of comments tonight. At all of our public hearings, there was a variety of opinions on about, for instance, the voting requirements, if you want to call it that, the property owner voting requirements. Some people thought that 60% was too low. Some people thought it was way too high. In the end, we thought it was a way to at least to get property owner buy-in. We thought that buy-in was important, such that you would not have a small minority of people imposing something on the majority. That's what that's designed to do, is to have property owner buy-in. In terms of whether it should be all property owners in a proposed district voting or just those responding, originally we did have all property owners in the district, but as was pointed out to us, probably there would never ever be a district then, because how many people can you get to vote in anything, honestly? Even a presidential election, would you ever get 60% of all voters to vote in any important election? So can you really expect that the same for a neighborhood conservation district vote as well? And so it is, we did change it such that it would be 60% of those responding. Again, some people feel like it's too high, some people feel like it's too low, but we felt like maybe this was a good compromise. And I guess if you have any questions about anything else, I'd be happy to answer them.
Mr. Bowersox.
Robert, thank you for all your work on this. I do have one question. Based on one of the comments tonight, Diana Visick made a very good point that there may be sort of a double standard between what it takes to submit a registered preference, which is no less than 50% of the title interest in the property, versus what it takes to submit a valid protest, which right now the wording is you have to be the majority of the title interest in the property. Do you see any problem with making those two consistent, maybe making them both say that no less than 50% is what's required, just so that if half the people say they want to register a preference in support or opposing, that's who can do it. If half the people want to, half the owners of a property want to protest, then that's what it takes to do it. Does that make sense, or was there a reason for that distinction that I'm missing here?
Yeah, that makes some sense. Now, in terms of on the side of the protest, that comes from our zoning ordinance protest procedures, and then that in turn comes from state zoning law. And there is some specific language in the state zoning law about protests and how that's to be figured. So if we wanted to go with something that was across the board, I would suggest going towards the protest way of figuring that.
Any other questions? Mr. Roberts. Okay. Lynn Barnes.
Under item D, it talks about the neighborhood conservation district applications. And a couple things. Well, we talked a little bit about this, the minimum of 15%. But it's kind of unclear to say or by a neighborhood association or organization, because some organizations might not have any bylaws or rules, or, so it could be like 5 people get together at a neighborhood organization meeting, and 3 of the 5 want to do this, and then they do it in the name of the organization. I mean, it's unlikely, but that seems so vague. I'm not that comfortable with that being in there.
Could I suggest some language there? Maybe could we say something like in the proposed district or by a recognized city neighborhood organization? Would that?
I don't think that still gets at my concern, because again, we have 3 neighborhood organizations.
No, we have
but
5, I think.
Yeah, but, I mean, are they governed by bylaws? How do you really, in earnest, say that I'm representing my neighborhood organization?
Right. Well, what we could do, here's an idea. I guess you could say it would be a registered organization with the Secretary of State's office. That's a possibility.
Or why not just leave it out? You would think that any neighborhood organization would be involved in this kind of.
Yes, that's another possibility. What I suggest not doing, though, is necessarily pre-designating or preordaining particular organizations, because something I've learned is that it's very interesting, but there are lots of different organizations with neighborhood groups who have varying opinions, and not any one group speaks for the entire neighborhood necessarily.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Roberts.
Okay. Now, I don't really have a problem with that, and here's why. First of all, what bylaws do 15% of parcel owners have? If 15% of the parcel owners would meet in my kitchen, what kind of bylaws regulate their decision-making habits, or they don't have any stated goal, or they haven't instituted themselves as an organization? You have just random parcel owners coming together to propose a project. In a way, it would be actually more credible if a neighborhood organization, which is a defined organization that has membership and it has meetings, it has a board or chair that leads it. It's probably been recognized by the city as a acceptable representative of a certain district in the city by a street and district. Why couldn't they indeed be more probably competent to put together or put forward a recommendation for a conservation district? The thing is that we have here in the ordinance 2 different ways of doing it, and let's just. So I think that if you would consider how much effort it takes to invent, to come up, to dream up, or put together a proposal to bring before the city, and then have it vetted through all the various different kinds of stages of approval that this document requires. I think even people who have not had any experience, say, in putting together a program would have the assistance of the city in refining it, so that when it was proposed, it would actually be a workable proposal. So on one hand, we have 15% of just random parcel owners, or we have a city organization. Does the organization need to be recognized by the city? It's probably helpful, but I don't think we have to define that. Okay, you could say maybe the Legion Post in a neighborhood would want to put such a proposal forward. Well, their proposal is going to stand on the merit of the proposal. And remember that whatever group of people or parcel owners you have to get 25, limited to 25, at least 25 people, property owners, to agree to it. So you're going to have to make a pretty good case. I think that if you make it too difficult to make a presentation or come up with a plan, it's going to actually stifle the ability to use this document.
Lynn Barnes. And I guess my only point is it doesn't preclude, if you leave neighborhood organization out, it doesn't preclude a neighborhood organization from doing it. It just makes it clear by leaving it out what's required.
Well, if you think a neighborhood organization is competent to do it, why don't you just leave it in?
Because I think it's just not a clear definition of what a neighborhood organization is and what it would mean, and as long as you have, again, are we looking at 15% of parcel owners? Okay.
Okay.
Charlie Smythe?
I guess I feel like we should have a motion on the floor and make amendments at this point. I don't know.
We were kind of asking questions, but if you'd like to make a motion.
Yeah, I'd like to move ordinance number 2007-06-059, an ordinance approving a text amendment to the zoning ordinance of the City of Urbana as presented in our packets.
I second that.
Okay, motion by Mr. Smythe, seconded by Mr. Roberts. Ms. Chenoweth.
I have similar concerns to what Ms. Barnes said, because neighborhood organization isn't defined here, and I don't know if it's defined anywhere else in our code, and because there's nothing in this that says that a group of people couldn't meet in private, say they're a neighborhood organization, decide by whatever means they decide, and say, okay, now there's 0 folks in this district who want this, and we're going to initiate a conversation. Not because that'll actually make the neighborhood conservation district, I know it has to come back to council, but because it will make a lot of work for staff that really is not necessary, like the bar is too low at that point. So I don't necessarily like to do these things on the floor, and I'd like to hear from staff if there's a suggestion, but I was thinking either take it out so it's the 15%, or by a neighborhood organization, by a vote of members at that organization, of that organization, at a meeting publicized openly to all of its members. So something that makes it clear that you actually can't have a secret meeting, call yourself a neighborhood organization, and then do this, because we don't really define what that means.
I would accept that as a friendly amendment.
So you're just deleting the, you want to make a friendly amendment there?
Do you want to vote on it?
I think, yeah.
You prefer if I should make a motion then?
Could I actually hear from staff first, because I'd like to their input on that language.
Well, I was struggling with the suggestion you just made, which was how do we define pin down neighborhood organization, and that's one way to do it. Did also want to mention that we do have a map that we use of the boundaries of all the major neighborhood organizations. We use this for demolition review purposes. So I could offer that map, but I think, as Robert said, that's going to change over time, so perhaps it is better to set some limits on your definition of neighborhood organization to move forward. But we do have a map that we use. So if you want to refer to something official, we have a map that's got the current boundaries of Zuna, Woona, Huna, and Yucatan. And it covers much of the city, but not all of it.
Would the, are you aware of whether or not all of those organizations have bylaws and open meetings to their membership?
They all operate somewhat differently.
Okay, and do you think that having some kind of language like, what did you have before, a city-recognized neighborhood organization would describe what you're referring to, these particular maps?
I think actually that would, because that map recognizes, or you could say that meets regularly. We've had some of these come forward as neighborhood groups for neighborhood organization grants, but not all.
Mr. Roberts.
Well, I think it's really interesting that a person who, I guess I disagree with the councilwoman, because if this is considered a grassroots experience, and if you imagine that there can only be certain kinds of neighborhood associations or organizations that can begin to build a new vision of their neighborhood for the city of Urbana, I think it's restrictive. For example, I could picture people in Landis Farms deciding to do something, down the road somewhere, or maybe Sunnycrest or some other neighborhood that would like to get together and make a neighborhood conservation district. And maybe the issue won't be the same one that would happen in Woona, but it would be maybe a completely different viewpoint, or they might have a different concern. It might be about traffic or safety. It might have to do with like safety or the need for a park, or something that they would want to preserve or bring to their neighborhood. So, I would imagine that even a homeowners association might choose to discuss in the future a neighborhood conservation plan. So I think the more that you limit it and the more you try to define what these neighborhood associations or organizations have to be, I think we may lose some of the creativity that would come from the people themselves in our community.
Ms. Chenoweth.
I'll make a motion so we can move forward on this issue. A motion to amend the motion on the table to add both things that have been recommended. So page 5, section D, end of the paragraph would read as the following. Applications shall be made by means of a completed application form provided by the city and may be initiated by either a minimum of 15% of the parcel owners to be included in the proposed district or by a city-recognized neighborhood organization by a vote of its members of that organization, forget of the organization, by a vote of its members at a meeting publicized to its members. That's my amendment.
Is there a second to that? Okay.
Charlie asked me to just repeat it. The very end says, last line says, included in the proposed district or by a city-recognized neighborhood organization by vote of its members at a meeting publicized to its members.
Okay, there's a motion by Ms. Chenoweth, seconded by Mr. Bowersox. Any discussion? Ms. Barnes?
So in that case, could you have a meeting that's publicized by, say, SUNA, and you have 50 people show up, none of which live in the area that is being potentially, because it's only 25 houses, 25 parcels, right? It could be, minimum, say it's 25, to say nobody shows up from the 25, but then there's a vote taken, and there's no representation there from the area to be considered.
It's kind of unlikely, don't you think?
It is, but it is, but I mean, I guess to me, as long as you have the 15% of parcel owners, that's good.
Mr. Roberts, I believe you're next.
Okay.
Any other? Wait a minute. Okay. Ms. Chenoweth.
I'll withdraw the emotion. I'll withdraw my amendment and move to strike or by neighborhood organization.
And strike the word either.
Where's either?
Right before a minimum.
Yes, strike either in the third line and or by a neighborhood organization in the fourth line.
I second that.
Okay. Motion by Ms. Chenoweth, seconded by Ms. Barnes. To amend the motion.
I've got a comment.
Strike either and end the sentence after proposed district. Mr. Roberts.
Well, I guess I'm going to just reiterate. I think that recognized, I have really no problem actually with the wording that Danielle came up with, having listened to it again, because you didn't require percentages. You just said that it had to be a plan that was accepted by a neighborhood association who meets, and it was a known meeting. I think that's totally fair. I think the neighborhood associations or organizations often are extremely useful in helping form or help their neighbors talk about. So an open forum where people do bring up situations. I think if there was a desire to have a conservation district started, if there were concerns, you would turn to your neighborhood association or your neighborhood organization for guidance, and that would be the place where it would be born. So to take those words out of the ordinance seems to actually almost behead one of the most useful forming patterns or tools to initiate one.
I would just like to point out that this doesn't preclude the discussion from initiating in the neighborhood association.
Exactly, correct. It can facilitate it. It can,
yeah, but all it says is that you have to have 15% of the parcel owners.
So the neighborhood organization could get that 15%.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Help coordinate.
Exactly.
Okay. Anyone else
Well, it would then.
want to comment on this? Okay, let us vote on this amendment then. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Nay.
Okay, motion carries. Now to the motion by Mr. Smythe that was seconded, I believe, by Mr. Roberts. Mr. Bowersox.
So I have another amendment, the one that we sort of discussed a bit ago. On page 10 in section K4,
Yeah.
with regards to how many signatures, what amount of the title interest of the property is required to submit a registered preference form in favor of opposition or not in favor or opposing. The change would be that if the third line from the bottom on page 10 in section K4, it currently reads, if multiple owners by the signatures of owners representing no less than 50% of the title interest in the property, I would move to strike the words no less than 50% and replace that with the words the majority, so that it would read, if multiple owners by the signatures of owners representing the majority of the title interest in the property, and that would match what we do later on page 11 in M2.
Yeah, that,
Second?
yeah.
Okay, motion by Mr. Bowersox, seconded by Ms. Chenoweth. Any discussion on this amendment?
So what
Mr.
happens in
Smythe.
a 50-50 tie?
The mayor votes.
Well, you know, that's the situation. If you have two property owners or four, you know, if you have an even number of property owners, you could have a split. And so you're sort of stuck here.
Well, it says majority.
So it would fail. It would fail in the
So it would fail.
It would fail. Okay.
Right.
Any other questions? All those in favor of this amendment, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carries. Any, Ms. Barnes?
I have, on same page, item 4, I have a concern still about the issue of signatures of 60% or more of the responding owners. And I hear, Robert, where you're coming from in terms of getting the vote out. But that could be kind of scary, you know, because you could, you know, depending on the communication, and I don't know, I wish there was some other bar, you know, like as long as that exceeds some percent of the total. I just think it doesn't make it, it makes it, could make it fairly easy for it to go forward, and there still could be people who are like, what, I didn't know about that, you know, what's going on, Danielle? Oh, I called on you, sorry, I am not in charge. Simmer down now.
Yes, Lynn, I have a similar concern, and I thought that just see if this would address your concern, which is if under number 3 we said shall be mailed a certified copy of the Plan Commission's recommendation, then we're positive that they received it, because there's a lot of issues. I agree, there's a lot of issues, and it's simply not fair if somebody doesn't receive the ballot to move forward with that. I just think that, especially because we're talking about districts where it's not a lot of expense for the city, it might be 25 to 30, 35 houses, and the addition for certified mail is not significant. So
I'd be supportive of that.
if you would be supportive of that, I'd like to move that we change.
Uh-huh.
Okay,
He
we
wants it
have
to
a
be
friend,
friendly.
we have a
Okay.
friendly amendment. Is it, would the seconder support that?
Yes.
Okay, so certified, it shall be mailed, shall be certified mailed.
Shall be mailed a certified copy.
Yes, certified copy.
Certified copy.
Correct.
Okay. Are there any other changes to this motion? Okay. Let us vote then on the amended ordinance.
Do you want to read the amendments?
Would I like to read the amendments?
Can you read the
Keep track
amendments?
of the amendments. Okay, the first amendment was on page 5, item D. Delete the word either in the third line, and then end the paragraph on the fourth line after proposed district. let's see where the second one was. I believe the person who made it could tell me where they are. Page 10. Okay. That was on the third line from the bottom, just instead of saying representing no less than 50%, it says representing the majority of the title interest in the property. And the final one was to add certified into section 3 on that page. So it says, shall be mailed a certified copy of the Plan Commission's recommendation.
Okay.
Okay, would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
Yes.
Mr. Bowersatz?
Yes.
Ms. Shanaway?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Ms. Stevenson?
No, and if I could speak to my vote.
Yes.
I still believe that NCDs inhibit creativity because in here we have design guidelines, and I just think that when we have design guideline, it inhibits creativity, and I have the right to voice my opinion, and that's my vote. Thank you.
Okay. The motion carries. Okay, moving on, ordinance number 2007-10-119, an ordinance approving the designation of a local historic district, the 800 block of West Main Street.
Yeah.
Robert Myers.
If I could, I'd just simply like to point out that we have a deferred motion on the table. I checked with our city attorney on how this works. So we have a motion that was deferred from last time based on the reconsideration. And that's that ordinance number 2007-10-119, an ordinance approving the designation of a local historic district, the 800 block of West Main Street. That's the motion that is on the table at this point through the way our deferral rule works.
And who made the motion and seconded it? Do you recall? Well, we can find that out later, but, okay. Is there anything that you need to add, Robert Myers, to this discussion?
No, other than you've been provided with some additional comments received by email today, and I've provided that on everyone's place here tonight. And also, based on what may happen tonight, I understand there's several different possibilities that have been discussed. So city staff's tried to anticipate what may happen tonight, so we can assist you with in terms of the ordinances if we should get to that point. But
okay, I have two people that want to speak at this point, I believe. Glenn Stanko, do you want to speak now?
My client Howard Wakeland's going to join me, so you don't all beat up on me. He's going to protect me a little bit here. I am Glenn Stanko. As you know, I represent the Wakelands, who own 4 properties in the proposed historic district and object to that historic district. I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because I don't know what the motion is that apparently is in front of you or what the different scenarios might be tonight, but perhaps I can anticipate where you might be going, and I'd like to just give you a brief review of where we've come on this process. Thank you.
Could we ask when this was typed, when it was put together?
Well, we'll look at it in a minute. We have participated in this process from the beginning, and initially there had to be a preliminary determination made by the Historic Preservation Commission. We submitted our comments in writing and made an oral presentation, and some of the things that we pointed out at that time were that we didn't think that it was right that 14 properties would be included when there were arguably only 4 properties that had historic value. We also felt that many properties in the block had been misdesignated as contributing instead of non-contributing, and we relied on the 1985 PACA survey for our support that they had in fact been misdesignated and should have been called non-contributing. We pointed out that there were at least 2 properties that were considered to be detrimental. We pointed out that we didn't believe there was any factual support in Mr. Folk's petition for the claim that a number of these properties supposedly had significant heritage value, whatever that was intended to mean. We also attached a copy of a deposition that Mr. Folk gave in a court case in 1999 in which he testified that Mr. Wakeland's property at 811 West Main in Urbana had no historic value, and in his petition he was claiming it did have historic value. In short, we didn't think it was fair to pull in 14 properties when only 4 arguably had historic value. The best characterization made of this, I'll have to give credit to Mr. Lewis. In his remarks several weeks ago, he called it guilt by association. I wish I had come up with that characterization, but I think he captured the essence of what was happening to all these other properties in order to essentially protect 4 properties. We then participated in the public hearing process before the Historic Preservation Commission. We pointed out the same factual deficiencies, explained our arguments, expanded on our position. We didn't, and in the end, we didn't feel like we got fair consideration before the Historic Preservation Commission for a couple of reasons. Number one, we had requested the opportunity to ask Mr. Folk some questions because he was the petitioner seeking to impose a zoning overlay on the Wakeland property. City Attorney's Office agreed that we should be able to ask questions, but the Historic Preservation Commission was clearly outraged by that. If you don't believe it, go back and watch the last 5 or 6 minutes of that video after everyone had left the room. It's not a high point in Urbana city government, I'll tell you that. Also, I don't think that they were prepared to perform the function that they were being asked to prepare, and that was to sit as neutral fact finders to recommend facts to this body. And I will say, I think all the people on that commission are fine people, and they have a passion for historic preservation, but that passion is inconsistent with the idea that they were supposed to sit as fact finders and decide whether or not Mr. Folk had proven the case that he was supposed to prove. Again, we didn't think that that step was fair to us. 6 property owners filed objections which required a supermajority vote by this council. 5 votes were required in order to pass the recommendation made by the commission. The 5 votes weren't there. There were only 4. The other 2 objectors were Carl Long and Judith Barracks. Mrs. Barracks lives at 808. Mr. Long lives at 812. So at that point in time, the vote failed. I think this was October 15th. The proponents left the council chamber. The opponents left the council chamber. I happened to be here because I had another matter, and lo and behold, a 5-minute recess gets called a little bit later. While Ms. Chenoweth goes and lobbies the 2 people who voted against it, and the 5 minutes turned into 10, 15, 20 minutes, and we came back and there was a motion made to reconsider because staff had a lot of time in it, and conceivably I think Mr. Lewis articulated the idea that maybe there would be a smaller district that would be appropriate that everybody could live with. And Ms. Stevenson seconded it, but as I recall, that second was conditional on not including anyone who objected to the newly proposed or reduced historic district. Again, we felt that this was unfair because it appeared that the matter had been concluded and now it has been reopened again, and here we are tonight. I will tell you that as I go back and look through the Historic Preservation Ordinance, I don't think this council has the right to do anything but vote up or down what the Historic Preservation Commission sends to it. The Historic Preservation Commission had the right to reduce the district. I don't see that power given to the council. Now, I'm smart enough to say that if you go ahead and do that and don't include any of the Wakeland properties, there's not a darn thing we can do about that. So if you have on the table a proposed historic district that doesn't include the Wakeland properties, and that gets passed, again, I guess there's nothing that we can do about that. I will say, I don't think it's fair to Judith Barracks, who I think is an older lady who isn't here tonight. I don't think it's fair to Carl Long. But, you know, you'll have to make that call, I guess. I would point out in terms of fairness, and most of you have heard this, but in closing, when Mr. Wakeland and his family bought these properties back in the mid-'80s, they did so because the city sent out a circular saying that this was an enterprise zone, being a blighted area, and the city wanted people to invest in this enterprise zone. They invested, particularly in the 3 properties where the houses were located, knowing that the zoning was multiple family and with the idea that someday they would redevelop those properties. That was their expectation. They knew they couldn't burn the houses down, but they also thought that they could build multiple family residences. So what happened, their expectations were changed by the downtown to campus plan. That whole area was downzoned to single family residential. Then Mr. Wakeland started building, well, he did build a house consistent with R2 zoning. He built a single-family residence. And what happened? Now his neighbor files a petition to again seek to change his expectations as to what can be done with that property. And I would point out it's always easy for someone to do something to impact what his neighbor can do on his or her property. But what if it's his property? What if you flip that around? You know, people aren't so happy when someone next to them turns it around and says, well, I want to do something that's going to restrict your property. What we think you should do is reaffirm the vote that was taken 3 weeks ago or whatever it was. This district should, this ordinance should not be passed. We should not go back and change something that we thought was a done deal when the vote was taken 3 weeks ago, and I would urge you to do that. I'd be happy to ask any questions you might have.
Ms. Chenoweth.
Speaking only for your client and referring to your September 2007 letter, Mr. Stanko, it's my understanding that there's a single property of Mr. Wakeland's or the Wakeland family that is designated as historic in the initial motion, and that property is 809 West Main Street. Since your memo, pretty much 85 to 90% of the memo specifically focuses on the issue of 809 and well, particularly that one being non-contributing, and you provide evidence for the history, some history of that. If 809 was to be considered a non-contributing property, in addition to what was already in the motion, which is all of the other Wakeland properties were not considered contributing, does that resolve your concerns?
No, we do not want to be in the historic district at all. And again, we have concerns about the people across the street, Mrs. Barracks and Mr. Long, who objected to this as well. But
I'm asking you to speak for your client, and in particular, I'd like to know what pieces of your letter remain if 809 is converted to is considered a non-contributing property.
Well, what remains is that we don't think that properties that have no historic value, and that would essentially be all the properties west of 803, 804, 806, and 807 should be included in a historic district at all. That was a piece that 809 was misdesignated as contributing when it should be non-contributing, but at the same time, our position is and has been that none of these properties belong in a historic district. You should stop with the 4 that everyone seems to agree have some historic value.
And just to follow up on that, it's our understanding from looking at all the other cities that establish historic districts that it's almost always the case that a historic district includes non-contributing properties, simply because over time, properties are run down, they're demolished, new properties are constructed. A district, by its definition, according to our ordinance, is a contiguous area. And so the properties must be contiguous with one another to be considered in the district. So wouldn't you agree that, are you arguing essentially that historic districts should not include non-contributing properties? Is that your argument?
I think non-contributing properties serve a function where they lie between contributing properties. Here, what you have are contributing properties that go no further west than those 4 properties that I have been talking about, and everything, at least on the south side, to the west of there is non-contributing. So what other contributing property are they tying the contributing properties to? That's my position. When you have kind of a pattern of contributing and there's some non-contributing in between, I can understand that, but you don't have that here.
So you would argue that properties being immediately adjacent to a contributing property is not sufficient, that it must be in between 2 contributing properties for it to be sufficient? Is that what you're arguing?
I think that's the function of non-contributing properties, are to tie contributing properties together.
Okay.
And in this case, they don't do that because there are no contributing properties to the west on the south side from those other 2 properties.
Okay, I appreciate you clarifying your position, and I think it's significantly different than kind of what the status quo is regarding historic districts in other cities.
Well, I can't speak to other cities. I think Urbana has to, I mean, we're here under the Urbana ordinance. We're not here under some other city's ordinance. I've also heard the argument made that, you know, streets serve as natural barriers, yet I go back to the Joseph Royer Historic District that has 2 houses in it. So there certainly is precedent in this city for a very small historic district.
Mr. Roberts.
I guess I'd like to ask a question about something that maybe was a little bit earlier. You know that the recommendation of the Historic Preservation Commission was unanimous that this entire block created an appropriate, by definition, historic district. Part of their, I mean, and I'm not going to talk about the training of the people that are in the professional training of the people that are involved on that commission. They also have informed us that it is against national practice and good practice to gerrymander a district and be, i.e., selective of certain properties and omit others. That if you're talking about a district, you're talking about a contiguous district that it doesn't have holes and like Swiss cheese in it. And we have just recently also heard testimony that it is customary in national and other standards to actually include non-contributing properties on each side of historic properties as a buffer, i.e. that it's totally appropriate to build a district and include buffer lots on the properties that are proposed. So we've been given these directions by basically, you know, the city's Historic Preservation Commission on a 7-0 vote, and I'm just wondering why you would think that we wouldn't be paying attention to what basically are the professional people in our community.
Well, again, the way your ordinance is set up, the petitioner is required to actually prove that this historic district is appropriate, and there's factors that have to be proven. And evidence of some kind is supposed to be offered. And what we were offered in this case, and that has never been explained, and what I have been continually critical of, is that many of these properties, specifically the ones that lie at, got my chart here, but many of these properties, such as 808, 810, 812, 814, 809, 811 were labeled as having significant heritage value, but there was really never any factual backup for that. It's just like, we say it, they have significant heritage value, that ought to be good enough. There was never any focused inquiry on, well, what is it that gives these properties significant heritage value? It's just that Mr. Folk said it in his petition, which turns out he borrowed from, I think, the one that was done for the whole Main Street corridor several years ago, the one that failed. And that was our criticism. Again, you know, and I tried to explain this to the Historic Preservation Commission when we were in front of it, and I don't think they were very receptive to it. And the later remarks by one gentleman who says, well, I don't want to act like a juror, but my point was, for purposes of what you're supposed to do under this ordinance, you really have to set aside a lot of what you think you know and look at what's presented to you in the hearing process. That's why there's a public hearing. Mr. Folk was supposed to produce facts. We certainly tried to produce facts and make legal arguments. And my complaint with what came out of the Historic Preservation Commission is that, and again, you know, I think they're all fine people. They all have a passion for historic preservation, but they didn't understand what their role as the finder of fact here was in this process. And it's probably the first time they ever had to go through it, at least with any significant opposition of any kind.
I'd just like to make one observation. It's my understanding that most law we have in the United States, case law, is basically built on the decisions that were made before. That much of the law that's passed in the United States today is based on preceding trials and preceding court cases and the results. I think that if you were going to say that it was unfair for Mr. Folks to use research that had been already submitted as an appropriate research for a historic district in times past, but that he can't submit such research today is kind of disingenuous to the whole process of the establishment of case law in America too. It's a process that I think we agree is an appropriate use of research that has been done by predecessors of the past. And it just says, like, if I were going to do a term paper, I would draw from very many sources. I would be, acknowledging their, I'd be footnoting where they come from, but you don't have to necessarily begin at the very beginning again to offer a proposal to the Historic Preservation Commission.
Well, your perception of the law is partially correct. The common law is developed by appellate level cases where appellate courts and Supreme Courts pronounce principles of law based on certain factual scenarios. However, the evidence used in one case is never evidence that can be used in another case. Each case stands on its own. Each case requires a new presentation of evidence. That's why I objected to people bringing in what they thought was the case other places. What we wanted was to focus on what Mr. Folk had to prove that this really should be an historic district in this case. You do not use evidence from prior cases to help prove other cases that may come up down the road. You use legal principles is what you use.
Any other questions for Mr. Stanko? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alice Nobreg?
Alice Novak, 601 West Delaware. Tonight you have a very busy agenda. Three of the items could be considered to be in some capacity related to historic preservation, certainly to different ways. But three of these items that you've talked about or will talk about tonight deal with preserving the character of Urbana. And we have confirmed that that's a desire of what we want to do through our comprehensive plan and through our preservation plan. The preservation plan has a number of ways to call attention to why this is being done, why preservation is a value in our community, and language such as enhancing, sustaining, and protecting the remaining historic resources in Urbana is in the interest of the public's general welfare. There is a whole paragraph on the significance within an abbreviated history of the city of Urbana, a whole paragraph on West Main Street as important. And I think from those of us who date way back to 1997 and being involved with the development of the Historic Preservation Plan as a steering committee and eventually of the ordinance, this is certainly at the top of our list for quite a while. There's a clause about preserving the character of historic neighborhoods. To protect the character of historic neighborhoods, the plan and ordinance will. And it goes on to talk about adverse effects of development that is inconsistent with historic districts as each is defined. I'm thrilled that you're talking about preservation in a variety of concepts, through neighborhood conservation districts, through enacting possibly a historic district, and through possibly enacting a demolition delay. You have also talked extensively, and hopefully we'll talk more, about financial incentives. And I think in each of these cases, at the root of this has been the desire to have historic districts, to have a preservation of our character. Our best tool is what we already have on the books. I hope you still consider all of these other things, but we already have the ability to designate historic districts. That is singly the best comprehensive way we have to protect our character in the city of Urbana. I hope tonight that you will strongly consider very seriously enacting what will be our largest historic district at this point. At this point, we have 7 individual landmarks, and we have 2 historic districts. There's been reference made to the Joseph Royer Historic District, and that's not to be made a joke of. And the fact is, it's a rather anomaly in the occurrence that there was a main house that belonged to the Royer family directly, and there was a mother-in-law cottage in the back that related to the compound as it is. And so that made sense to link those 2 properties together. We do, as you've said tonight, look for a historic district designation that makes sense. Our other local district is also a National Register historic district, and it also makes sense with its boundaries. It's 8 related Spanish Revival style cottages in Buena Vista Court. They were all built at the same time. They all are the same architectural style. They all relate. So we look for things to relate and make sense. There's been a great deal of talk that's been bantered around as far as perhaps reducing the boundaries of the district. I do support fully the full extent of the boundaries. If you have to reduce the boundaries, I hope you'll consider some rationale to that. If, for example, 813 West Main Street appears to more face Lincoln as a thoroughfare, then perhaps that's a good rationale to exclude that particular property from the 800 block historic district on West Main Street. I do caution you to be very careful at what your rationale might be for possibly eliminating properties. The other thing that's been discussed has been the concept of contributing and non-contributing, and there's several aspects to this. I've been a consultant in historic preservation for over 20 years, and I've written a great deal of National Register historic district nominations in a variety of states. All of these include non-contributing properties. It's just part of the makeup of how these things work. Sometimes, there's even half of the properties in a district, potentially, that could be non-contributing properties. And one example close to that is the Broadway Historic District in the city of Rock Island. There are over 800 buildings included, and because there have been a number of garage additions and artificial sidings and things, there were almost an equal number of contributing to non-contributing buildings. But still, it was something that passed for National Register standards. National Register standards are a much higher threshold for what we look for in designation. And while our ordinance does pick up on some of the standards for National Register, the 4 criteria for listing in the National Register, we also extend that so that it should be an easier threshold to make to have local designation, because that's the only way we truly get preservation and protection for these properties. So, again, it's something that's common to have non-contributing buildings. I would also say that if the 800 block were just big what if proposed as a National Register historic district, the property at 809 West Main Street would definitely be a contributing building. I've heard mention of the property having artificial siding, and I'll note that that's asbestos shingle siding that is now a historic siding. Probably dates to the 1930s, 1940s, mid-1940s at the latest. There was reference made to the porch. The porch would appear to be an early 20th century alteration to the house. That's a historic change. There was mention made to the radically altered balustrade on the porch. If you look at the porch and the full height Doric columns that are on the porch, I think it's likely that it never had a balustrade to begin with. And so someone put a railing up, perhaps for safety reasons, and that may or may not represent an alteration at all, in fact. Another property that's been mentioned is 812 West Main Street on the other side of the street. And that, too, I would say, even for National Register standards, would still be considered to be a contributing property. And despite the fact that it has artificial siding, it's clearly evident the original roof line has a number of original windows. It has wide eaves. They're a stylistic element as well. You can see clearly how the porch was infilled. It has a brick foundation that's still exposed. The entrance, there are a number of features that are still creating the readability of the style in the period in which the house was constructed. So, you know, I don't think it's coincidence that the things that have come up for consideration to change to non-contributing are those represented by owners who are objecting to the status of the historic district. I guess in conclusion, I'm sure it's difficult to be in your position, I have no doubt. It seems that what's happened in the past has been that the squeaky wheel has been a very vocal, non-owner occupied minority in these cases, and I think it's time for us to switch the squeaky wheel and listen to the residents and the dedicated occupants of the historic district who overwhelmingly support this.
Alice?
Mr. Smith.
I'll ask a question that I asked of Mr. Long earlier, which is how do you create and maintain the character of a neighborhood? Is that the role of these non-contributing houses? And where do you draw the line? Does the house across the...
It is for non-contributing. I mean, I would say it doesn't make sense if you're looking at ways to whittle away to the boundary of a district that you wouldn't want to count something immediately next to a contributing building as a non-contributing property. Across the street, it depends on how the location is. If it's something that's on a corner that, you know, perhaps has some kind of a boundary distinction in that capacity. I mean, we don't do, as Dennis said, you know, Swiss cheese or donuts for historic district boundaries. So, of course, one of the reasons that anybody would want this designation is for design review. Absolutely. I mean, look around at what we're dealing with. That's why you just created the Neighborhood Conservation District.
If you have a historic house on one side of the street, you'd want design review of the house that faces you on the other side of the street. Is that what you're saying? If it was a non-contributing property?
Possibly. I think it's more crucial that properties on either side of a contributing property would be included.
Okay.
Anyone else? Thank you. Okay, we have a motion.
Could I speak? I didn't sign up, but could I speak?
Sure, come on up.
A happy family.
Yeah.
I'm Diana Vasek, and I'm still at 608 West Pennsylvania Avenue, deep in the heart of Boona. I think the discussion of precedents was incredibly important, because no matter what you think of historic preservation, or of Main Street, or of Mr. Wakeland himself, you are tonight setting a precedent about how you treat people who are involved in this process. It is very important for future historic districts that you treat everyone absolutely fairly, because otherwise you will be bringing up all kinds of opposition. So if the fact-finding process was flawed, if there was lobbying to change the vote, if the vote was flawed, or if anything else was flawed, it is going to make people very suspicious about how the city is going to treat other historic districts and neighborhood conservation districts. People will feel that the deck is stacked, that they're not going to get a fair hearing, that evidence will not actually be looked at, that they will be railroaded. So whatever you consider tonight, take very careful consideration about fairness and precedent. And if there are any difficulties in this regard, it would be better to back off, wait the stated delay period until you can bring it up again and do it right. Thanks.
Mr. Lewis.
Oh, I don't have a question for you.
You want to make a comment?
I just wanted to comment. I guess I have to say something at this point because I'm just one of the squeaky wheels that raised the problem last time. And I did reconsider the vote. And the reason for that was because staff had invested a great deal of time and effort in trying to address the concerns of everyone in this room, plus those that are not in this room. And in doing so, I think some very critical things have come up with regard to how we deal with people, not structures or anything else. I think it's admirable, and I applaud our Historical Preservation Commission in terms of their look and review of the historical values, and I think the zealousness can go a bit far when you get hooked up in the concept of design and how it feels to you, how it looks, how it tastes, and all that. But you can never, ever forget about the people and what they mean, irregardless of their station in life or their status. One of the things that I proposed, and I don't know if it'll fall through or blow up or whatever, but I think the most important thing is to consider the needs of the people. And there are a number of people that desire to have a historical district or area or whatever you want to call it. There's a number of people that wish not to. My solution would be that those that have the desire to join in that the historical district would do so. Those that did not want to be a part of it, they're not a part of it. But with the caveat that we would take into consideration the street of Main Street, down Main, as a part of that process, and determining what this historical area might entail. Since there's a number of houses all the way down to downtown that, to me, potentially could qualify. But with the caveat of having design review for those homes that may eventually be abandoned or rebuilt. That was my proposal. Hopefully my colleagues on the council will consider that and think about the people for a change and what they might need. Thank you.
Ms. Chenoweth.
With that well-spoken introduction, I'd like to make an amendment to what I believe is the motion on the table. It's my understanding that the motion on the table is to designate the entire block historic with the Historic Preservation Commission's designations of what is contributing and not contributing. And it's my understanding that that original motion failed 3 weeks ago. And so, since that original motion failed, and in the spirit of compromise and some of the things Mr. Lewis is referring to, I'd like to make the following amendment to the motion, which is that in addition to adopting the ordinance, this is the designation of the historic district on the 800 block of West Main Street, and this refers to the historic preservation case number HP 2007-D-01, with the that we would deem the following properties contributing and uncontributing. So there's a change of 2 properties from the original motion, and those 2 properties are 807.5, those 2 properties are 809 West Main Street and 812 West Main Street. And so that's my motion. I'll speak to it if I get a second.
Motion by Ms. Chenoweth, seconded by Mr. Smythe.
So if I could just speak to that motion briefly. First off, so the discussion points of this motion is that I think we need a win on Main Street. I was with the last council when we had a loss. It was on a psychological level for historic preservation in the city as a whole. It was a great loss. I think, and so when I saw this come forward, I thought, okay, here's a chance to have a win for historic preservation on Main Street. What's interesting is not only how contentious the issue is, but also how pretty much every single person I've spoken to on whatever side it is, and I've heard an earful in the last 3 or 4 days, is when I say, don't you think Main Street is obviously a historic corridor in the city of Urbana? Everyone says, yeah, Of course it is. It's got beautiful properties. And so I think, okay, can we start with that, which is that it's very clear that as a community, we recognize that Main Street is a historic corridor, and that currently we have no protection of it whatsoever, other than standard zoning, but really no protection above that. So there's been no designations of any historic properties on Main Street. I do know there's some on the National Register, but I'm referring to local designations. So, one, we need a win, and this might get us there, especially since our original motion failed. Second, I think the win would be stronger with more support from council members, and I do believe that this is something that takes into consideration the concerns that Robert addressed. I felt that it took the concerns in that Heather raised 3 weeks ago. Of course, she can speak to that herself, and it does so for the following reasons, which is that essentially it acknowledges the concerns of the protesting property owners. Basically, there's not a single protesting property included in here, and I know there's some contention over the 808, but the protesters at this point, there's not a single one that's included as a historic designation with a higher bar of regulation. It's simply design review, and I believe that if we took and brought a historic overlay, just simply design review to West Main Street, I would believe that would probably pass council. So I'm thinking it's very similar in that way, in that it's simply for the folks who do not support this. They happen to also, I think we're lucky in this case, those properties are of questionable historic contribution. Certainly, all due respect to the Historic Preservation Commission. I've also driven by the houses. I've looked at the data. I've tried to have a fair assessment, and I believe that these two houses, which I'm moving to be non-contributing, are on the line of that designation from my reading of the ordinance. So they could go either way. And in this case, I'm recommending that they go the direction of non-contributing. This establishes the compromise between no district, which is what we had 3 weeks ago, and the Historic Preservation Commission. And I think that this paves the way for establishing a historic corridor down Main Street. So I appreciate your support for this, and I think that this is a compromise that hopefully we can all live with and move forward as we look at further designations of clearly historic properties on Main Street, like the 500 block.
Can I be addressed?
Ms. Stevenson.
Danielle, to address something that you said, and that is that what I said was that I didn't want to see homes in a historic district of the owners that did not want their properties included. And so when you say that I said something about non-conforming or contributing or whatever, you said it didn't state what what my intentions were. My intentions are, if you want your home in a historic district, that's your business. And if someone else doesn't want their home in that district, then that's their business. And to impose your will on someone else, I think is completely wrong. And my position hasn't changed on that.
Ms. Barnes.
I had hoped that we'd be able to come up with a compromise and talk a little bit to Danielle about this. And I think it's clearly would be great to have those houses that are of obvious import involved in a historic preservation district or in historic district. I am concerned, however, that we still have one contributing property in this amendment, 808, and it's owned by someone who is clearly against it. And so I have that concern. And then I also have the concern that tonight we kind of asked on the fly of the owners of 812? 812. And then Mr. Wakeland's property, we kind of asked them on the fly, would you be okay with this? And it kind of sounded like you'd be okay with this. Of course, you don't know too much about it to be able to speak to it. And then I understand from Mr. Wakeland's attorney that they would be uncomfortable with this. And I guess I would like to see us continue to try to come to compromise so that we are fair to everyone on the block because someone said earlier who was supportive of the historic district said, we have the investments made, and we want to protect the investments of everyone on the block. We have to consider that. Absolutely. And so that's just as true for those who are supportive of this district as it is for those who are not supportive of this district. And so I think if we can keep at it a little bit, maybe we can get there. I'd like to see something happen, because I think, you know, there's a lot of good about what's being asked and requested of us tonight, but there's still a lot of angst, I think, from several of the properties on this street.
Ms. Chenoweth.
I just want to speak to that, the issue. It's my understanding that 808 and 807 and a half this week went through a certificate of appropriateness process to build a new home on that empty lot. And it's my understanding that 808 has gone through is going through the certificate of appropriateness process, and it looks like that will be successful in the rebuild of a porch. So it's my understanding with 808, and the reason that I left that in, and I did give that some consideration, is one, that there's differing opinions of support. I've spoken to people who Ms. Barracks asked directly to support this district, and therefore she seemed in support. And I also know that she's gone through that hurdle already in terms of the rebuilding of her porch and the certificate of appropriateness, and the city's working with her. So I felt comfortable in that way with moving forward. But I do hear your concern, and I believe that that's been met.
Okay. I have a comment, follow-up comment.
Ms. Barnes.
Well then, since 807 and a half and 808 might not be issues if we talk further with those owners, would it be possible to have a historic district that would have the houses that are east of those properties and then those two properties as buffers? Because we've talked tonight about having, you know, the importance, and yeah, bless you. Yeah. You know, we talked tonight about, and I was listening, and it does make sense. You know, you don't just necessarily want to have like 4 houses. You know, I can see the need for some sort of buffer. I see that. On the other hand, I also kind of see Mr. Stanko's point, where a whole strip of non-contributing, you know, might not be so critical. But what about those having the buffer of those 2 houses, and then the 4 be, and then that would be a 1, 2, 3, 4, what is a 7 parcel historic district? I mean, it's just another thought. But.
Mr. Smythe.
Well, I think I can sort of address that, Lynn. I think that part of what we're trying to do is find a balance between 2 different opposing views. We've got a pretty good compromise here that I think meets just about everything we'd want, because we've seen how design review works on Green Street. We've got 2 apartments that were built using the design review process that fit into the neighborhood. And so the owners of those properties take a lot of pride in the fact that they've built properties that fit on Green Street. I've talked to Mr. Barr, one of the owners, at length about it. In fact, he turned around and built another building in a very similar fashion because of his positive experience with that. He got an even nicer property closer basically on campus. So I think that the design review process is the least onerous thing we're doing to those that we're including in this entire block. And by doing the entire block, we guarantee into the future that the character of the neighborhood and the historical corridor gets started. This is the entrance to basically, you know, the original piece of Urbana, and I think by simply imposing the least onerous thing we can do, design review, we establish an entire block that hopefully can move further eastward towards downtown, and that I think we do set a precedent, as Ms. Vizek has said, and I think that precedent is to find balance. We've heard from Mr. Stanko. You know, we talked to Mr. Long. He seems pretty comfortable with the idea of design review. That's not too onerous a burden, and so I think that we have found a good compromise that gets us down the road towards what we've been asking for, what we've wanted for a long time, which is some kind of preservation of the cultural history of this community. And you're out of order, Mr. Stanko. You're out of order. You're out of order. Okay? You follow precedents of law. You had your chance. Please let me speak.
Well, you're misstating a fact, and I'd like to correct it.
Oh, let him finish, please.
Okay. You know, it seems so appropriate to sort of, I object as somebody's trying to reach their conclusion. It's basically a bullying tactic, and I really resent that, Mr. Stanko. I really resent your butting in at this point. The whole point of historic districts is to maintain a character that is sorely lacking in Urbana. We have no place where we can drive down and see a visually contiguous set of properties anymore. We've destroyed so much, allowed so much to be destroyed since the 70s. You know, we've got bits and pieces. Green Street has a little bit, Elm Street has a little bit. This Main Street is the last chance to have any continuity in putting something together. And we've got, 3-4 blocks here of really what is an original historic Urbana. We have some to the south of Lincoln Square. We have some to the east of the city building, but they're all scattered. This is a contiguous piece, and when I've been in other communities that have large swaths of historic properties, Galena, you've got 800 properties in a district in
Rock Island.
Rock Island, thank you. These communities have done something significant. If they can do it, why can't we at least do a block? Thank you.
Mr. Roberts.
At least we're having a really open and honest discussion in this chamber tonight. We have heard a lot of different opinions, all the way from the beauty of architecture to the needs for respecting property rights. We don't want to make this what I think is a very forward-looking, future inspirational moment in the history of the city. Could potentially be very historic, that we would establish the first fairly large, continuous section of what we hope to be an even a farther extended portion of one of the most important historic routes through our town, which is now called Main Street, to become a recognized historic district for our city. As you know, the biggest we have so far is six Spanish-style bungalows, a house with a little apartment behind it, and the Victorian cottage. And that's pretty much the paltry amount of historic preservation we've been able to accomplish so far. So, I look back. I brought in our comprehensive plan for the city that we drew up, and we adopted in 2005. And some of the goals, these are some of the major goals that were established in the comprehensive plan by agreement of long discussion with the residents of the city. Urbana's unique character. Goal 12.0, preserve the characteristics that make Urbana unique. Objectives 12.1, identify and recognize neighborhoods and areas that contain significant historical and cultural resources. Well, we're doing that exactly. And it didn't say particular buildings. It didn't say a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It said areas, historic areas or neighborhoods. Second, 12.2, it says pursue the establishment of historic landmark and or historic district status for sites that have contributed to the history of Urbana. Certainly, you'd have to say that this street, there's a lot more that we could start defining as contributing to the history of Urbana or being unique in Urbana. You could go to Carl Park, you could go to East Urbana, you could start talking about the downtown, but we're not doing that. We're just taking a block. All right. And then it says also 12.3, encourage public and private partnerships to preserve and restore historic structures and sites. So these are some of the basic, or in the very beginning of the comprehensive plan for the city of Urbana. If you go to the map on page 81, future land use maps having to do with West Urbana, if you look at the swath with 2 blocks either side of Main Street, it says right there, preserve historic properties considered to meet historic landmark criteria. It's right on the map. It's right in the book. We talked about this for a couple of years, and we agreed that this whole section, basically, it's the corridor that Main Street establishes visually here on this map, is the whole point of that corridor is to preserve historic properties considered to meet historic landmark criteria. Well, the Historic Preservation Commission says that this block certainly does. And they voted 7-0 in favor of adoption for it. Now, I do think that the compromise that Danielle has proposed, by which we reduce some of the properties designation to non-conforming or non-contributing, it kind of waters it down slightly. But if it is acceptable to the people who are on the street, and if it provides the very smallest amount of oversight on their property, I think we're actually working with them in a very lenient and open and kind of conciliatory manner, while we can still establish the larger goal that was drawn up by the entire city, and not just by 4 property owners, to establish historic areas in our town. If we cannot make Main Street a historic street or a historic district, I wonder what we could make into a historic district. I would be kind of at a loss. And so I guess what I want to do is I want to remove the focus from the fear to the excitement. And let's actually do something tonight that's really fantastic, and it's historic, and it's the beginning. It's like, okay, we've had a flood. The river has eroded the boundaries of our banks, so let's throw some sandbags up and try to preserve what's left. It's almost like a Katrina moment down here, and this is like this street's almost like a mini New Orleans. I think it's time to throw up some sandbags.
Ms. Barnes.
I do want to take the opportunity to go ahead and clarify Mr. Stanko's comment, or what he wanted to share, that Mr. Wakeland has applied for a building permit, which is correct, for 807.5, but he has not applied for a certificate of appropriateness. And that isn't all closed. It's not all done deal for him at this point. Correct? Everyone on the same page on that? So maybe Robert can clarify for us.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
Thank you, Robert.
Right. Well, the Historic Preservation Ordinance, rather than imposing a moratorium on the district, a proposed district, it allows property owners where they need to make improvements during the period of review of the application. They can still make those improvements if they go through the certificate of appropriateness process. In other words, even though it's not a district, it will allow property owners to go ahead and make those improvements if they can get the approval from the Historic Preservation Commission. And Mr. Wakeland has indicated he needs to move forward with his project. He can't wait. Frost is coming. He needs to get foundations, or at least footings in the ground. And so this is a way that the ordinance provides that we can move forward. Now, the Historic Preservation Commission meeting is on Wednesday, and anticipating tonight's meeting, we went ahead and, well, the ordinance says that the building permit application becomes the certificate of appropriateness application in this case. So we went ahead and forwarded it to the Historic Preservation Commission. We provided a staff report, and so if this property happens to be in a district, it'll be ready for Wednesday night. If it's not in a district, they won't even need to consider anything. The building permit will just be handled just as any other building permit.
Okay. Mr. Bowersox? Okay.
Just a quick follow-up. Can you share the staff recommendation on that?
Staff recommendation is for approval of the application, and the same for 808 West Main Street, which is basically across the street, is Mrs. Barrick's property, where she needs to put on another front porch, which is in very bad condition. And in fact, we had some concerns about the safety of anyone using that porch, so we had it blocked off. And we're actually working with Mrs. Barracks in order to get that rectified, and she has a certificate of appropriateness application to replace the front porch. So that's on for Wednesday, and the plans that were drawn up by the people doing the work, wonderful plans, and city staff is recommending for approval for that.
Mr. Bowersox.
Well, I just wanted to first thank Robert and Heather for even letting us talk about this tonight. I know that you made this motion to reconsider, and I really appreciate the fact that we get to discuss it and consider again, because staff have put so much time into this, and the community has, and I hope that we can strike some compromise to save all the work that's been done and to start to build some momentum for Main Street. I support this compromise. It's not great. I don't want to take more properties and take them out of the contributing category and put them into the non-contributing, as this motion does. But in the spirit of compromise, I'm ready to support it. Tonight is about precedent. Somebody said that. And I think, to me, the important precedent is that we could move forward in a way that doesn't do Swiss cheese or, whittling down districts, but instead move forward in a way that protects a block and makes careful use of contributing and non-contributing properties to buffer them. And I think Danielle has done a very careful job of considering which fall in which categories and what makes sense. I also think this is about precedent, and I hope that we can move forward in the spirit of compromise and start protecting Main Street and set a precedent to protect more of it. I know there's people on other blocks of Main Street who have historic properties and want to be bringing forward applications. So I hope that tonight is a precedent for a sort of consensus-based process for us continuing to consider these. I do want to mention that if I support this motion as Danielle's put it on the table, and I hope other people will as well. If other folks do make amendments to change it more, or to take more properties out of the contributing, or to significantly shorten this district and make it, half a block or something, I wouldn't support that. And if that were the case, I would be ready to make a motion that would sort of take us back to the full block, but maybe take out one property like 813. And I just want to describe this scenario because I've had some conversations with our legal staff on our staff and wanted to make sure everybody's on the same page about how the vote could happen tonight. I'd be prepared to make a motion to take 813 out of the district. There are reasons that it could be considered not to fit, and to move ahead with a district that is one less property. And it's my understanding from staff, and Robert, if you could clarify anything here that I say wrong, it's my understanding from staff that then with one less property in the district, that was one of the properties that had opposed and submitted a registered preference against this, that then the supermajority requirement would actually go away. And with 4 positive votes, we could move forward and make all of this except 813 a district. But I don't want to do that because I would like us to find a compromise tonight, and I'd like us to, on these historic preservation issues, continue to work together. I'm willing to support this compromise even though it's somewhat weaker, but if it's further weakened, I would be ready to make the motion to take out 813 and move ahead. So, Robert, if you could clarify maybe a little if I got that right. If that one property is removed, does that change the percentage so that we no longer need a supermajority this evening?
Well, the question was asked in the context of someone from the public asked this question of a council member, and the council member asked us to clarify that in the ordinance. So we approached city legal staff. What does it mean if the geographical boundaries of the district change? What does that mean in terms of voting requirements? That was the specific question asked to us, regardless of whatever geography that we're talking about. And in speaking with city legal staff, they felt like that indeed the ordinance before the council at the time of the vote compared with the property owner protest in that proposed district at the time of the vote, that's what really governs whether or not there's a 2/3 majority voting requirement or whether there's a majority voting requirement. So that was the that was the explanation that was provided to us by, or excuse me, that was the interpretation that was provided to us by city legal staff.
So in other words, to clarify, if I made a motion that took out one property, that changed the percentage so that there wasn't the opposition, the level of opposition that would require a supermajority, then 4 of us would go ahead, or could go ahead, and approve the district without that one property, a smaller district. But nonetheless, it would only take 4 to approve. Am I understanding at least the process tonight correctly?
Yeah, is that what you said?
If the boundaries of the district should change such that one property would be taken out and that one property was a property that was protesting, then the way I've done the math, that would be less than 40% of the properties represented in the district. Less than 40% would now be protesting, would be 38 point something or another.
Okay,
so I wasn't thinking necessarily in terms of one particular property, but if you leave out one property that's protesting, it would change the percentage.
Yeah. I mean, I guess others could give feedback on that. 813 to me seems like the property that makes the most sense, and if this compromise isn't something that we all could agree to, then that's something I'm willing to move and to put on the floor. But I actually don't want to go there. I actually would rather us sort of continue the discussion and look for compromise. And I think Danielle's motion is good. I'm not happy with it, and I'm sure people on all sides aren't completely happy with it. But I guess I wonder from Mr. Lewis, my colleague, what he feels about this compromise as it's written, how close he feels this is to what he wants to support.
As I stated, I want to make sure that those that want to be involved are involved, those that don't want to be involved are exempt, okay? And how you draw that thing is fine with me. The numbers don't have to change. But in terms of establishing what properties are historic, we know what they are. We know that we can play the game with non-contributing and contributing and all that, but we know in reality what properties are and what properties are not. We know who the people are that want to be a part of the district, and we know who the people are that don't want to be. And my view is, if you have people that want to be, allow them to be that. And what I was trying to get to is that I was on the planning commission, for the comprehensive plan, and I know what they want to do with Main Street. So my view was to take into consideration the expansion, not just the block, but the expansion down Main, and take into account those other homes that are down there, those people that want to be involved. And, I don't get into the contiguous and the ramifications of contiguous and all that, but we have properties that we want to preserve, period. And we have people, period, that want to be involved and people that don't. So that's a simple equation for me. We pick those that do and those that don't, and we establish the best arrangement of that scenario as possible, instead of trying to manipulate the system to try to get these people where they don't really want to be. So those that want to be involved, fine. Those that don't, we go there and say, this is the conglomerate of, this is this abstract thing out here that we got to put together. And I would recommend the staff take a look at what that really means and how it can grow. That's why I said place the caveat of the design review, so that once this is started, then we can go on down Main Street and continue.
Ms. Chenoweth.
I just have a follow-up question for Robert and then a comment in response to Heather and Lynn, and I will be finished for the evening on this topic. The first is, so does this motion meet that?
If all these folks that are on here are willing, I don't think they are they?
So you're saying no, it does not?
No, it doesn't meet the concept that I view.
But I thought...
Okay, that's different than what you said to me yesterday. And it's also what you,
I've been saying the same thing. I've said the same thing to everybody that I've met outside of this council chamber on what my view was. And my view was that we go by what the people want. And what the people want is what we try to address. If we don't shove nothing down nobody's throat, we do accept those that want to be, those that don't want to be, and we go there. And we try to build from that nucleus the best possible historical
okay,
situation we can.
so I see that as reneging on a compromise vote that we have worked for a week to establish. And I think that what Brandon has made clear is that if you renege on that compromise vote, that 4 people can establish the entire district as originally proposed. I have tried very hard to accommodate your concerns and the concerns of Heather, and I don't see this as...
That's a lie. That is a bold-faced
So,
lie. Folks, let's simmer down here.
So I see that the property owners, in the case of design standards, get all the benefit with almost no responsibility. I think the argument with Heather is what participation means. I don't see them as participating in the historic aspect of the district. All they have is design review. And I am sad to see that all the hard work at a compromise has ended up with a situation where basically we're going to go back to something extremely divisive. And I'm sorry that you have to do that, Mr. Lewis. I'm extremely disappointed with you at this point.
Well, I have not changed my status of what I think is important.
You told me yesterday. Okay.
I'm closed this issue. My point is clear.
Okay. Mr. Bowersox.
If I could just take a step back, because I do want to understand before we get to a vote or a different motion. It seems to me actually like the motion might really do, Mr. Lewis, what you suggested, because it seems like the motion, at least as I understand it and as I'm trying to recall, who supported and who opposed the district. Danielle's motion puts the people who opposed it down into the non-contributing category. So in a sense, all they have is design review if they were to demolish and build something new. But other than that, they aren't really subject to the historic preservation rules, I'm adding on a room or I'm altering my windows and my doors kind of rules don't apply to them, just the design review. So maybe my first question is to staff. Robert Myers, am I understanding it right that the people who oppose the district in Danielle's motion really are all now in the non-contributing category? So that the only thing that would apply to them is, except maybe it's 808 with Mrs. Barracks, where we already sort of maybe have the porch issue resolved. But that all the other opponents are really moved into the non-contributing category, so that the only thing that applies to them is if they build a new house, some design review, that it fits. Is that correct? And am I understanding that right? That we've really taken them out of being contributing properties that would be subject to the full meal deal?
I'm sorry, I'm comparing some maps
I can
here.
answer that, I think.
Lynn Barnes.
If, the way I understand it on my little paper, is that if, the only situation that they would be exposed to public review would be in the case of demolition.
Yeah.
So anything else that any of those property owners would want to do would not be exposed to public review, but rather just assistance with staff. That's how I understand it. Have I got it?
Is that right?
It's okay to say no to me.
There's different standards for contributing and non-contributing
Right.
properties. And yes, that's true, that the contributing, non-contributing properties have lower standards in that. I'll give you an example. It's very specific. Table 12.1 is for projects that are contributing. Table 12.2 are for projects that are non-contributing. And so, for instance, if you look at structure, and on that table, structures less than 50 years of age at the time of designation. there's only two things that they would need to go to the Historic Preservation Commission for. One is demolition, the other is for construction, and construction could be new construction either of an entire structure or an addition. And so if they build in an addition, or if there were new construction, or demolition, a structure less than 50 years of old, which is non-contributing, that's the only thing you would go to the Landmark Commission for.
Who is next?
I believe I was.
I just, very briefly, I would just like to point out also that in the people who have had, in the properties where there is a protest, for the large majority, except for perhaps the building 809, which is a two-story yellow house with a porch, all of the other buildings are either in excellent shape at this time and probably not subject to experience the need for either immediate repair or change, or else it's a vacant lot, and the person who's building on the property has already got their plans approved by the city staff, and I don't see that there'd be any problem pursuing future construction on that site. So I'm not seeing how the property owners who are protesting are in any way in danger of having their properties impinged upon, considering the current state of their properties. Thank you.
Heather?
I will not be bullied, and I will not have my words twisted. And when I reconsidered Danielle, I was told that what would be brought back would be something that did not include anybody's properties that were not wanting to be in the district at all. And so my words have been twisted, and that's why I called you a bull-faced liar, because my words were twisted when I did the reconsideration, and I don't appreciate it.
Mr. Bowersox.
Well, I just wanted to sort of continue down the line of inquiry. I think actually this motion kind of does what Heather, mostly what you just said and what Robert Lewis had said, that the people who oppose it are really not in the contributing category. So other than there being review if they build a new home, they aren't really subject to the typical historic preservation rules. I wanted to ask about Mrs. Barrick's property. The Robert Myers, maybe if you could clarify a little. It's my understanding, I've heard mixed messages, that she was sort of for and then sort of against this, and with the certificate of appropriateness issue being handled with her porch, do you feel like she's still somebody who is in opposition to her property being contributing and being subject to historic preservation type certificate of appropriate reviews, or is she somebody who's supportive at this point?
The only direct information I have is the protest form that she turned in. I don't have any other direct information from Mrs. Barrick's.
I have two questions.
Thank you.
Ms. Barnes.
Thank you. Two questions. So this house that Mr. Wakeland is proposing for 807 and a half, right? This is the one that it's kind of received some preliminary review by Historic Preservation Commission. Is that true?
Not yet, but on Wednesday night. It's been reviewed by city staff in terms of the historic preservation, the historic district requirements. We made a recommendation to them. They'll meet this coming Wednesday night to consider that.
So that's technically the jury is out on that.
Yes.
As well as the porch. And I have a
That's
second
right.
question. I get two? And Brandon, may I ask this of you? If you decide to move ahead, if the compromise doesn't go, and you decide to move ahead with the everything on the block except for 813, would you be including the same properties as contributing and non-contributing as were involved in the initial request? Or would you be altering them per Danielle's compromise?
I would just take the initial request that sort of came to us this evening from last meeting. So the request as it came from the Historic Preservation Commission and from staff.
Which would place some properties that Danielle is proposing this compromise as non-contributing back to contributing, correct?
Yeah, that's true. The original
Okay.
version of this did that, yeah.
Mr. Roberts.
I just maybe it would be helpful for me to just mention that I did drive past 808 Mrs. Barrick's home this weekend. I found that the porch was being removed safely by a volunteer crew from the Empty Tomb. They did it totally as volunteers. They're not being paid to do so. There was a construction company there helping. I think that Mrs. Barracks actually is extremely pleased by the result. And I'm just saying that, I think she signed her X on the form that she filled out as being opposed, but actually she's has commented before verbally that she actually supported the district. She's having appropriate reconstruction of a brand new porch for her home at very low cost and volunteer labor, and it meets the certificate of appropriateness. I don't really see that as being a problem for Mrs. Barracks.
Mr. Smythe.
I'd like to point out the irony of this is that we had originally dropped 813. At the very first vote, we'd be over and done with, and we would have included more properties that don't want to be in than, with respect to the full-blown version of the district as opposed to historic district. And it's always an option to, drop this and go back and do the whole thing all over again and leave 813 out, in which case we'd be right back here having the same arguments and same discussions. So it strikes me that if we simply accept this compromise, which includes the design review for some people who don't really want design review and others who find that it's not a burdensome thing, and we've got evidence that it's not burdensome given Green Street, I would urge us, let's just get this done. Support the compromise proposal that's been put forward with as many votes as we can put out here tonight, and move forward with the beginnings of a historic district. Thank you.
Mr. Bowersox.
Yeah, I would just second that. I agree that that you're right. Without one property, or if this came back to us again in 6 months, this could just all happen with only 4 votes. I guess with regard to Mrs. Barracks, that's one area where if she has registered a preference against it, and I haven't personally spoken to her, I'm comfortable moving that into the non-contributing group so that really people who didn't want to be in this wouldn't be in the contributing category and wouldn't be subject to the full historic preservation review. They would all be in the non-contributing list. So that's something I'm comfortable with, if that sort of helps to make it really clear that the people who are opposed don't have the review when they do an addition or do all these things that otherwise would trigger the Historic Preservation Commission's action. So I'm okay with that change about 808, if that helps people move towards some compromise, and hope that we can work towards a compromise. I agree with Charlie and look forward to doing this one way or another.
Lynn Barnes.
I think that makes sense to move 808 into the non-contributing. It does make it cleaner. It makes clear that our statement as a compromise is that we want those who are not for this to have the opportunity to only deal with design review. And I think given the other alternative, in terms of those who are against it, I think this is better than the other alternative that we're presented with tonight.
Mr. Smythe.
I have a question for Mr. O'Neill. It's my understanding that, issues that come from various commissions, including the Historic Preservation Commission, are essentially advisory to the council, and that we are open to most extent. There's some things that are very clearly defined where we can't change things, but that it is within our ability to change and move things from contributing to non-contributing in this case. Is that correct? Or to drop properties?
Excuse me, yes. I mean, I would have to look at the enabling ordinance for each of the commissions you're talking about. I'd hate to paint it with a broad brush, but yes, in a limited basis, I've spoken to you before about this. I think there's some limitations, but I think if you're talking about one or two properties that you feel clearly do not fit within the district, perhaps because of their geographic location or because they clearly do not fit within the other schemes or design schemes for the rest of the properties, yes, you can remove one or two of those properties.
And a follow-up, if we move 808 to non-contributing, but then Ms. Barrick, say, might change her mind, what would it take to, amend the district later on to move her property from, say, non-contributing to contributing, if that's something that she would desire?
Say it again.
Okay, suppose that we set 808 as non-contributing tonight, but down the road, the owner decides that she wants to be part of the historic district and be a contributing property. Is that something that she would have to just go through the whole historic district process with the commission and everything?
It's an interesting question, Alderman, and I don't know.
Okay.
I really don't have an answer for you because I never contemplated. It seems like once the district is set, I really don't know. I can't anticipate what it would take to add a property to that. I suppose we'd have to go through the process. Maybe Robert could provide some insight in that. This is really under his purview.
There are some instances where properties would change from contributing to non-contributing or vice versa after a property is, or a district would be enacted. And usually that's because of, let's just say there's a fire. There's a contributing property, there's a fire, the property's destroyed, then obviously you wouldn't want to treat a vacant lot, or whatever goes on that vacant lot, just like a contributing historic property. So the status needs to change. One way to deal with that is to have an whereas statement in the ordinance to identify which are contributing and non-contributing, but not necessarily have it in the body of the ordinance so that it's necessarily the force of law. But it does identify. By doing that, it would identify it does identify some direction on how to deal with that property in the future in terms of design review. But you're asking a little bit different question, not on a technical basis, if the status of the property changed because the property owner wanted it to. I never thought about that issue before, honestly. I mean, usually it's done on a technical basis. It was contributing before, but something disastrous happened. Now it's non-contributing. Occasionally, you'll find a house that was non-contributing. They've taken off all the siding. They've restored it. Now it's a beautiful,
That's
wonderful
exactly what I'm
property.
thinking of, yeah.
And now it changed to a contributing status, and that's a possibility as well. But that's, again, that's usually a technical consideration rather than a property owner preference.
Alderman Smythe, were you contemplating, just so I understand the question, were you contemplating this be done with the homeowner's acquiescence or without? In other words, would the change from non-contributing to contributing be upon of her own volition, she wants to do it, or you're talking about some other entity, organization, homeowners want to bring it in?
I was thinking in terms of the scenario that Robert just pointed out. The house gets restored, for example, and the owner of that house wishes to be part of the district. What do they have to do? That it's just the flip side of a fire, and I don't know what our provisions are for doing that. Whether somebody can just come to the plan or come to the historic district or historic preservation commission and petition on or whatever. And I don't see, did Alice leave? Yeah.
Well, worst case scenario, we can amend the ordinance to get that fixed.
Ms. Stevenson.
Brandon, when you said that this motion that Danielle brought addresses my concern about non-contributing, actually, I will reiterate what I said, and that was when I did the reconsideration, it wasn't about contributing or non-contributing. It was about property owners and whether they themselves wanted their property considered for the district or not, and not whether their home was to be in the district and how it was to be in the district or not in the district, conforming or non-conforming. It was about the property owners and their desire. And so this doesn't address that, because what I was told was that that was going to be brought back. That was the district that was going to be brought back, were the homeowners that wanted their home to be part of the district.
Ms. Barnes?
Robert, I have a question. Ornamentation and roofing is also a part of the review that would have to go to the Historic Preservation Commission for properties that are older than 50 years, even if they're non-contributing. So there are a couple other things in addition to the demolition and construction. Are those arduous in terms, or could they be made arduous to a homeowner? Or is it just a matter of we don't want a flat roof and we need, what are these called?
Pitch roof.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. I mean,
Well, okay, I'll give you a scenario. Roof pitch, for instance, if you have a predominant roof pitch or kind of a range of pitches within the district, and then if you have a house that where they would radically change the roof pitch so that it would be a very low pitch, it could be out of character, out of the range, and so generally in that case, what we do is we work with the applicant, their architect, or whoever is the designer, to try to get them to have a roof pitch that's somewhere within that range. And that comes into play, including garages as well. If your main house has a certain roof pitch, and then you come in with a garage that also has a pitched roof, but it's a radically different pitch roof, a very low pitch roof, we would work with the property owners, with the designer of the garage, and suggest that they use a different roof pitch.
tell me about ornamentation. Just a quickie about an example of that.
I think.
I mean, would the HPC insist on, I don't know, balls on top of the stair thing, or
Okay, there's ornamentation. Is a good question. This is the category of structures more than 50 years of age at the time of designation. It would be improper to really speculate and require people put on ornamentation on their buildings that wasn't there. And so really what you're talking about in terms of ornamentation is removing historic building fabric or ornamentation that's there, rather than trying to add. You never want to speculate and force people to add something that may or may not have been there, or creates a false sense of history. Those are two no-nos in historic preservation.
One other quick question.
Okay.
Thank you for indulging me. This house looks pretty good to me.
Okay.
I mean, it seems to, it's two-story, it's got roof pitch, there's a little bit of ornamentation on it, and this was brought by the landowner, and it seems like a pretty good fit without even any push on our part. I don't know, I mean, again, I'm no architect, but,
Design review is not very onerous, exactly.
well, I'm trying to just see how, you know what I mean, I'm trying to, okay. Thank you.
Just don't make it a windowless box that no one stays in it.
Right.
I mean, come on, we're not asking for much here.
Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, this is the first time I've seen this design. I mean, I don't know where that came from, but already I see there's shutters, there's a gable ornament, there's, okay, I didn't open that up. Okay, there's some molding at the top, cornices of the pyramid roof. There's looks like an octagonal window. I mean, these are minimal things which you'd find in most houses, you know, because they're advantageous and they look nice. And I think this is the sort of thing. It's the removal of ornamentation that is a concern in a historic district.
Mr. Bowersox.
One last comment with two simple requests. One is, I guess I would urge the mover and seconder to consider taking as a friendly amendment property 808 West Main and moving it to the non-contributing category, because Mrs. Barracks has still filled out a registered preference, and that's what we have on file, is that she's opposed. If that would help us build some compromise here, I would ask the mover and seconder to consider that. My other request is that as we move closer to a vote to the city clerk, I would just ask that the vote on this motion be a roll call vote, just so that we know where people stand on this motion before we go for the final vote on the final motion. I'd like people to be on record and have a sense of where they stand before I consider making some substitute.
Okay, this motion was made by Ms. Chenoweth. Was it Mr. Smythe that seconded it? Okay.
I believe so. I guess I have a question for Lynn then, which is, seems like we have two options on the table. We can either move this, but we need, and have the votes to do that, and then make the final motion, or we do, we go the route of Brandon, which I think is very inflammatory, given the, what happened 3 weeks ago. And so my question to you is, would you support this motion if we moved 808 from contributing to non-contributing?
Yes.
Okay, then I will take as a friendly amendment that we move 808 from contributing to non-contributing. And so would Charlie, so.
Okay. We have a motion by Ms. Chenoweth, seconded by Mr. Smythe.
I don't like it.
And there's an amendment to shift 808 from contributing to non-contributing. Are we ready to vote on this? Mr. Bowersox has requested that we have a roll call. Is one council member enough for that? Okay. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
Yes.
Mr. Bowersox?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Ms. Stevenson?
Okay. That amendment carries. So now let us move to the ordinance as amended.
This is in anticipation of this motion more or less passing. This is almost the correct motion. It simply has 808 in the wrong category.
So is it different than the other one?
This is the full ordinance, which is actually articulation of my motion.
Okay.
Except that
All
808
right.
is in the wrong column here on the front.
Okay, so what we've already established that by the previous vote. Okay. Are we ready to vote on the ordinance at this point? I hope.
Yes.
Would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
Yes.
Mr. Bowersox?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Ms. Stevenson?
No, and if I could speak to my vote. Howie, I'm real sorry. When I was told a couple weeks ago, my words were twisted, and I'm really sorry that I even reconsidered this.
The motion carries. All right, move on. Reports of standing committees. Now, who was the chair from the standing committee? Were you the chair, Danielle?
Sure. From the Committee of the Whole, we have ordinance number 2007-10-118, an ordinance establishing a delay period for issuance of demolition permits for the purpose of historic preservation. And this was sent from the October 8th committee. For the Committee of the Whole, I so move.
Okay, motion by Ms. Chenoweth, seconded by Mr. Bowersox. Any discussion? Mr. Bowersox.
I had one quick amendment brought to us this evening by the public comment from Diana Vivisic. I just wanted to make one wording amendment on page 7 under heading F, section 7, heading F at the bottom of the page, the third line from the bottom. The original ordinance here is written that this ordinance shall be construed to prevent construction, repair, or maintenance activities, and I would like to add the word renovation so that it would read, nothing in this ordinance shall be construed to prevent construction, repair, maintenance, or renovation activities. Page 7, the bottom of page 7, section 7F, the third line from the bottom.
Would you please repeat that?
It currently reads that nothing in this ordinance shall be construed to prevent construction, repair, or maintenance activities, and I would like to add the word renovation. It would read, nothing in this ordinance shall be construed to prevent construction, repair, maintenance, or renovation activities.
Okay, is there a second to that? Seconded by Mr. Smythe. All those in favor? Oops.
Can we talk about a second?
This is, someone wants to comment on this? Okay, Ms. Barnes.
On page 3, on the second paragraph, where it says demolition and defines it,
Yes.
would it be more clear just to leave out the words "or in part," the exterior of a building?
Can I suggest that? In whole or in part?
Right, just
was a
leave-
comment, we could leave that out.
Just
and then
leave that out,
clarify.
and then
Where
it's
where is that, please?
on page 3.
What line? Second paragraph?
Under definition of demolition, I would suggest, if I could please, any act or process that destroys the exterior of a building, and then later on, we would clarify what that really means by the qualifier for construction, repair, renovation, maintenance.
Okay.
That makes sense.
All right. Is that a motion? Is there a second to that?
You have a motion already.
Wait, okay.
Let's
I'll
have,
we were commenting on the first one, I suppose. Let's just take these one at a time. First, we have Mr. Bowersox's motion, right? His amendment.
Renovations.
Now, was there a second to that? And that was checked. So let's vote on that one.
may I comment on it?
Okay, a comment on that.
All right, I'm in agreement with it.
Okay.
But for continuity, the first, section F begins with 3 words in italic: construction, repair, and maintenance. I'd like to add the word renovation to the italic copy as well, because it's being added in the sentence following. I think it's just for continuity.
Okay.
Great. That's a
It's a
friendly
friendly
amendment.
amendment.
To the amendment, yes.
All right, are we ready to vote on this amendment? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay, that motion carries. Now, we have one by Ms. Barnes.
I'd like to move to extend our time to 11:15.
To 11:15.
And that's it.
Second.
Now, what does that take?
That's my limit.
Since we've never done this before, what does that take?
A roll call.
A voice vote?
Oh, voice.
Okay. All those in favor of extending this meeting to 11:15, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay, that motion carries. All right, maybe we could have Ms. Barnes' suggestion as a friendly amendment?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is that with your approval? Okay, we deleted in whole or in part from page 3.
Right.
Is there any other corrections?
Where's our attorney?
Yes.
That was a friendly amendment, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
I wanna-
We're back,
Yeah, we're back to.
we're back to now. Can we do some more amendments?
I
Yeah.
had a question for Ron, but
Right.
go ahead and ask your question.
There's a concern with regard to the school district. Just want to make sure that either we exempt governmental units or that this area is not a part of what the block that they are considering. They have plans, and I think it involves a lot of, it's a whole block. And I don't think we want to be in a position where we've got 2 governmental entities kind of trying to work something out.
Mr. Roberts.
On the invitation and advice of the staff, I was asked to indicate potential boundaries for the eastern side of the city that hadn't received any kind of survey. And also, because I'm the board representative for South Broadway section below Lincoln Square Mall, I indicated a potential boundary for that as well. I did also receive the letter from the school board. I think it's more useful to the city and the community at large to have more than fewer municipality entities or just levels of discussion about the future use of the property contiguous to the school. if the school board alone has the ability to decide what those properties, the fate of those properties, just by purchasing them from willing landowners, that's one thing. But if that is also in an area that is designated as part of the neighborhood in South Broadway that has many historic homes in it, and was one of the areas where the city outbuilt during its heyday, if we can acknowledge that as being worthy of the 45-day demolition delay, we have to recall that it's not going to require any more onerous process for the properties involved on that street than any other street in the city that has demolition delay. And if the Historic Preservation Commission is brought, if there's a property that is brought to the Historic Preservation Commission in relationship to some block on Iowa Street or some property on Iowa Street, it will get its fair hearing on whether it is important to maintain or not maintain that building as a part of the historic structure. Again, the same kinds of rigor will be expected for the potential petitioner to show why that house is important to somebody. And I don't think that it is a great burden for the school system to be responsible for its demolitions any more than any other developer in the city. So I would say that I don't have a problem with the current boundary.
Mr. Lewis.
I'd ask for clarification on the tax increment finance districts and what your rationale was for excluding.
Okay. Yeah, the TIF districts, we excluded those because essentially there's already been established that there's a public need for redevelopment in the district. Mm-hmm. And so that there's a public policy already in place that in this district there's going to be reconstruction and new buildings, which inherently involves demolition. Okay. So if we, on one hand, we're saying that TIF districts, yes, these need to be redeveloped, and we understand there's going to be new construction and demolition in them, and then on the other hand, we say, no, we don't want that. We're working cross purposes.
And the other question was, in fact, Lynn brought it up with regard to the district, the 116. Why they're not excluded? They're asking to be excluded. What does that really mean to us? That they want to be excluded? Why would they want to be excluded?
The school district property?
Yes.
Well, I think their argument would be that whatever they do is going to be for a public purpose. And if you're using it for a public purpose, for instance, just to give you an example, that if necessary, eminent domain can even be used if it's for a public purpose. And so they feel like that would set up this opposition in the future between one government agency and another here. We're just setting ourselves up for those sorts of conflicts when all along we're talking about a public purpose. I think that would be their argument in that.
Lynn Barnes.
I think that's pretty well stated, based on the information I think we received, and also the school is, of course, governed by an elected body, just as we are an elected body, and it seems to make sense to not have them as a part of that for that reason. So I would want to make sure that in any demolition delay that we would pass that the government agencies would either be exempted or we made sure that that area that they're interested in is not included. Secondly, I'm concerned about, Dennis, I know, is thinking the more better, and I'm thinking less is more. And I'm a little more inclined to think of like 100 years as opposed to 75 years, because these properties, we have like 1,400 properties listed on this, approximately listed on these papers. That's a significant number, and I think in terms of staff work and just the amount of control that we're exerting, is an issue. And the other question I have is with regard to landmark designation. If in the 45-day period, someone wants to make that particular property a landmark, then is it correct that that could go on beyond the 45 days? As I read it in the ordinance, it seems like it is. It seems like that has to get resolved before.
Absolutely.
So that could go on months.
Well, it would go on as long as the ordinance allows. Our historic preservation ordinance has certain time limits that we have to work within. Obviously, we can't extend out in perpetuity how long, we can't just string that out forever, and so there are imposed time limits on when we have to act within. So it's, to give an example, from when the application comes to the Historic Preservation Commission, then they have 35 days, I believe that's correct, to make a recommendation to the City Council. And there's some time limits like that.
But it's true that it would extend clearly beyond the 45 days.
45 days, right.
Okay.
Ms. Chenoweth.
Just in response to Lynn's inquiry about the school district, and because of the lateness of the hour, I will be blunt, which is that I think churches and government entities have been the big demolishers in our community in the last 5 to 10 years. If you look at what has caused demolitions, and I know staff put that list together. So I actually think the city, the county, the school district, they actually should all be involved with demolition review, and we can get very specific reasons, like the library. There was the, what was it called now? Jacques House. There's the Fetius House currently. The county also knocked down the sheriff's building. Some could say the Elite could have qualified for historic. And also the school district has, certainly there's been friction between the city council, at least the former city council and the school district, over the issue of knocking down all those houses in that neighborhood, particularly because at the time, and I believe maybe it's changed, it was for parking, and we didn't feel that that was an appropriate use of space. Now they're talking about green space, but it's right next to Carl Park. I don't know why they need additional green space if they're next to one of the finest parks in town. So I actually don't know if that's really the case, or if it's actually for parking as it was originally designated. So I would like to just keep it as is and have the demolition review for all. Why should government be exempt from that?
Anyone else? If not, would the clerk please call the roll? Thank you.
Ms. Barnes?
No.
Mr. Bowersox?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Ms. Stevenson?
No.
Okay, that motion carries. Ms. Chenoweth.
Next, we have ordinance number 2007-10-121, an ordinance amending Schedule J of Section 23-183 of the Urbana Local Traffic Code prohibiting parking at all times on certain streets, Illinois Street, north side, east of Cottage Grove, for the Committee of the Whole. I so move.
Second.
Motion by Ms. Chenoweth, second by Mr. Lewis. Any comments? If not, would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
Yes.
Mr. Bowersox?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Ms. Stevenson?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Ordinance number 2007-10-122, an ordinance amending Schedule H of Section 2393 of the Urbana Local Traffic Code requiring stop signs at a certain intersection, Newport Drive at Skyline Drive, for the Committee of the Whole. I so move.
Second.
Motion by Ms. Chenoweth, second by Mr. Lewis. Any questions or comments? If not, would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
Yes.
Mr. Bowersox?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe? Mr. Smythe? Yes. Ms. Stevenson?
Yes.
That motion carries. Ms. Chenoweth.
Next and last, we have ordinance number 2007-10-123, an ordinance approving an intergovernmental agreement between Champaign County, Illinois, City of Urbana, Illinois, and the Urbana Park District in Champaign County, Illinois, relating to the development and management in the watersheds, which include parts of East Urbana, the county's East Campus, and the Park District's Weaver and Prairie Parks. For the Committee of the Whole, I so move.
Second.
Motion by Ms. Chenoweth, second by Mr. Lewis. Any questions? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
Yes.
Mr. Bowersox?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe? Ms. Stevenson?
Yes.
That motion carries. Reports of officers? Did you want to comment?
waited
No.
4 hours.
You have my report before you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
That's good. We're good.
Thank you. All right.
One thing I do want to mention is this coming Saturday will be the final market of the season, the market at the square. So November 10th is our last of the season, and then the market goes indoors and is run by Urbana Business Association.
Mr. Smith.
I just want to point out, Tom goes to Florida and they have tornadoes, so Tom, I would recommend that you find a safer place for vacation. Go north.
Okay. Okay, any reports of officers? Bill Gray. That microphone does not work.
I just wanted to announce that tomorrow night at the Phillips Rec Center, for all those property owners that have property in the Boneyard Creek floodplain, they've been sent out a notice to let them know that the floodplain parameters may have changed in their property, and that we're there to explain what those changes may be. The meeting is kind of an open house format, and just want to let you know it's from 6 to 8 o'clock. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Finally, under new business, we have a resolution number 2007-11-24, resolution of protest against a proposed text amendment to the Champaign County zoning ordinance, to amend the Champaign County zoning ordinance to add definitions and regulations related to gas pipelines, hazardous liquid pipeline, and pipeline impact radius. Recommendation from staff. Robert Myers.
Recommendation of the Planning Commission and the city staff is for denial of what you have, of the ordinance that you have before you, the resolution that you have before you.
Mr. Smythe.
I move that we deny resolution number 2007-1124, a resolution of protest against the proposed text amendment of the Champaign County zoning ordinance.
I second it.
Okay, motion by Mr. Smythe, seconded by Mr. Roberts. Any discussion? All those in favor of denying this protest, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries. Good night and good luck.